Tonight, let us travel somewhere very old, not to a city you might recognize, not to a century you have read about in books, but further back, far beyond the reach of any written word. We are going to a land that would one day be called France, though for most of our journey tonight, it will carry no name at all. This is a long story and a slow one, and there is no hurry in the telling. It begins in the silence of ancient stone and the flicker of a fire that burned before anyone remembers. It moves through cave paintings and standing stones, through Roman roads and medieval cathedrals, through revolutions and empires, all the way to the restless present. So, settle in wherever you are. Let the room grow quiet around you. Let the weight of the day fall away, and allow yourself to drift into a world that existed long before yours. The story of France is one of the longest any land on earth can tell, and tonight we will listen to all of it from the very beginning. Chapter 1. Before the name Stone, Fire, and the First Traces. Long before the rivers of France carried their modern names, long before any voice spoke words that could be understood today, this land already held the traces of beings who walked, hunted, and sheltered beneath its ancient sky. In the far south, near a village called Lesignan-la-Sebe, the earth holds something extraordinary. Buried within layers of ancient basalt, archaeologists have uncovered rough stone tools, perhaps 30 in number, shaped by hands that moved more than 1,200,000 years ago. They are among the oldest tools ever found on European soil. These were not delicate instruments. They were crude choppers, formed by striking one stone against another until a usable edge appeared. The beings who crafted them were not yet human in the way we understand the word. They belong to an earlier chapter of the story, a branch of life still finding its way through a vast and indifferent world. The landscape around them shifted with the slow breath of ice ages. Warm forests gave way to cold, wind-scoured plains, and then returned again over hundreds of thousands of years. Rivers carved fresh paths through limestone. Herds of animals drifted with the turning seasons. The earth itself was restless, and those who lived upon it had to be restless too. Nearly 500,000 years ago, in the foothills of the eastern Pyrenees, a cave became a place of shelter. The Conde de l'Arago opened from a cliff face 80 meters above a river. From its wide mouth, one could watch the Tautavel Plain stretching out below and see horses and bison drifting toward the water's edge at dawn. The people who sheltered here are known today as Tautavel Man. Their fossilized remains, first uncovered in 1971, belong to a subspecies of Homo erectus. They were not the ancestors of modern humans directly, but of the Neanderthals who would later inhabit these same hills. Their skulls show heavy brow ridges and low, retreating foreheads, shaped by a world that demanded endurance above all. Their brains were large, over 1,100 cubic centimeters, and their bodies were strong. An average adult may have stood roughly 166 centimeters tall. They shaped tools with more care than their predecessors, crafting notched edges for cutting and scraping, each one fashioned with a patience that speaks quietly of thought, intention, and steady hands. Life inside the cave was short and hard. Few individuals appear to have survived past 25 years. The cold was constant. Food arrived only through hunting or scavenging in the valleys below. Among the cave deposits lie the scattered bones of horses, reindeer, bison, and rhinoceros, the remnants of meals shared in the dim half-light of a stone shelter. Outside the cave entrance, the Tautavel plain stretched wide and golden in the warmer seasons. Herds crossed the open ground in long, slow lines, raising dust that hung in the still air. The river below ran clear over rounded stones. From the ledge of the cave, one could see for many kilometers in every direction, a vantage point that was, in itself, a kind of safety. Fire may not have been mastered here until much later, perhaps around 400,000 years ago. Before that, the darkness inside the cave, once the sun dipped below the cliff, was absolute. These early people slept, ate, and kept watch in a silence and blackness that few of us today could endure for even a single night. Hundreds of thousands of years slipped past. The world outside the caves changed beyond recognition, not once but many times over. Ice sheets crept southward and retreated. Entire species appeared, flourished, and vanished. Somewhere along the way, Homo erectus gave way to the Neanderthals, who were shorter, more powerfully built, and remarkably well adapted to the cold. The Neanderthals buried their dead, sometimes with care. They fashioned tools of greater sophistication. Thin, sharp flakes struck from prepared stone cores, with a technique that required foresight and planning. For over 200,000 years, they were the sole human presence on this land, and the marks they left behind are quiet but unmistakable. Modern humans, Homo sapiens, arrived in what is now France perhaps 54,000 years ago. They came from the eastern Mediterranean, moving slowly westward along river valleys and mountain passes. They brought with them something their predecessors seemed to lack, an instinct not merely to use the world, but to leave marks upon it, to shape stone and surface into something that carried meaning. Deep inside the limestone hills of southwestern France, in places where daylight has never reached, these newcomers painted, not idle scratches or accidental marks, but images of startling beauty, rendered on cave walls with pigments ground from iron oxide, manganese, and charcoal. They applied the color with their fingers, with pads of moss, and through hollowed bone, blown like breath across the rock. Many caves across France hold these paintings. The walls of Rouffignac are covered with woolly mammoths drawn in flowing black lines. At Cosquer, near Marseille, a cave, half drowned by the rising sea, preserves hand stencils and the outlines of seals and auks. At Chauvet, in the Ardèche Gorge, lions and rhinoceroses appear in compositions so graceful they seem impossible for their age, more than 30,000 years old. But the most celebrated of all stands near the village of Montignac in the Dordogne Valley. It is called Lascaux. Discovered in 1940 by 4 boys and their dog, the cave contains more than 6,000 individual images, created roughly 17,000 years ago. No one who has entered this place, even through photographs alone, has come away entirely unchanged. Across its walls and ceilings, herds of aurochs thunder in frozen motion. Horses gallop with arched necks, muscles suggested by a single sweeping line. Deer leap with antlers flowing back like branches caught in wind. One painting, known as the Crossed Bison, reveals something remarkable, a grasp of perspective and overlapping form that suggests these artists already understood the illusion of depth. They worked by the light of animal fat lamps, small stone dishes filled with rendered grease and wicked with twisted juniper fiber. The glow would have been golden, unsteady, and close. Each painter worked within a small circle of flickering warmth, surrounded by absolute dark, pressing color into rock that would hold the image longer than any kingdom, any empire, or any written word. In the darker and more remote passages, away from the painted galleries, handprints appear on the walls. Some were pressed directly into wet pigment. Others were made by placing a palm flat against the stone and blowing color around it, leaving a pale silhouette haloed in red ochre. These are among the most intimate marks a human being has ever left behind. What the paintings meant, no one can say with certainty. Perhaps they were rituals. Perhaps they were stories told in images, carried from one generation to the next. Perhaps they were gifts to the spirits of the animals whose lives sustained the painters. Whatever their purpose, they speak across the millennia in a language that needs no translation, a language of line, movement, and attention. Outside the painted caves, the world was warming for the final time. The great ice sheets that had once pressed across northern Europe were retreating, and they would not return. Forests thickened, rivers swelled. The herds of reindeer and mammoth that had roamed the open tundra drifted northward, and the people who depended on them found themselves living in a landscape that no longer looked the same. New plants spread across the lowlands: hazel, oak, and elm. Fish filled the warming rivers. The old ways of following herds across open ground began to give way to something more settled: camps beside rivers, seasonal returns to familiar places, a slower rhythm of life shaped less by the migration of animals and more by the quiet turning of the year. The age of painted caves was ending. The age of another kind of monument, one built not in the hidden dark but raised under open sky, was about to begin. Far to the southeast, in the lands around the eastern Mediterranean, people had already learned to plant seeds, tend animals, and remain in one place. That knowledge was moving slowly westward. When it arrived, it would transform this land utterly, from a country of wandering hunters into a country of villages, fields, and standing stones. But that transformation would take its time, unfolding not in years or decades, but across millennia, as gently and irresistibly as a river carving a new path through soft limestone. And so the land waited, as it always had, patient and unhurried, for whatever was coming next. Chapter 2. The Age of Standing Stones, Farmers, Potters, and Megaliths. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the world of the wandering hunter gave way to something new, a world of roots, of permanence, of clay shaped by hand, and of stones raised toward the sky. The change did not arrive suddenly. It crept westward from the shores of the eastern Mediterranean, carried not by armies or conquerors, but by the quiet migration of ideas, seeds, and small communities who brought with them a way of life built around cultivation and settlement. By around 6,500 years before the Common Era, the first traces of farming had reached the southern edges of France. Among the earliest of these new cultures was one known today as the cardial. Named for the patterns its people pressed into wet clay using the ridged edge of a cockle shell, this culture left its mark along the entire northern shore of the Mediterranean, from the coast of Greece through Italy and onward to the shores of southern France and the Iberian Peninsula. The cardial potters shaped simple, round-bottomed vessels suited to cooking and storage. The shells they pressed into the soft clay before firing left delicate rows of curved lines, sometimes arranged in bands, sometimes in zigzags, sometimes in patterns whose meaning is entirely lost to us. These were not merely functional marks. They were among the first deliberate decorations on any object made in this part of Europe. The appearance of pottery was not a small thing. It meant that grain could be stored more safely, water carried beside a sleeping place, and tough seeds softened into porridge over low flame. The rhythms of daily life shifted quietly around these humble clay vessels in ways that are easy to overlook but difficult to overstate. A new world was forming, one bowl at a time. With pottery came farming, and with farming came villages. Small clusters of houses appeared along the river valleys and coastal plains of the south. People planted wheat and barley, kept sheep and goats. The seasons, which had once meant only the restless movement of herds, now meant planting and harvest. The year took on a shape it had never held before. As the centuries passed, the population grew. Fields expanded outward from settlements. Forests were cleared with stone axes. The landscape, which had been wild and unbroken since the ice retreated, began to bear the visible imprint of human intention. Paths became tracks. Tracks became routes. Communities that had once lived in isolation began to meet, to trade, to share, and sometimes to quarrel. Nowhere is the ambition of these early farming communities more visible than on the wind-swept coast of Brittany. Near the village of Carnac, in the department of Morbihan, more than 3,000 stones stand in long, parallel rows across the countryside, stretching for several kilometers through fields of grass and low heather, silent beneath the Atlantic sky. The Carnac stones were raised over a vast span of time, beginning perhaps as early as 4,600 years before the Common Era. The most recent research places the earliest alignments among the oldest megalithic monuments anywhere in Europe, older by more than 1,000 years than Stonehenge. They are one of the largest concentrations of prehistoric standing stones on Earth. The stones themselves are rough, uncarved granite, quarried from local outcrops and dragged into position by teams of people whose names and languages have been entirely lost. Some stand barely a meter high, others rise to 4 meters or more. The largest weigh many tons. They were placed in rows so straight that their alignment can still be traced from the air across the modern landscape. No one knows with certainty why they were built. Some scholars believe the alignment served an astronomical purpose, marking the rising or setting of the sun and moon at certain times of year. Others suggest they were connected to funerary ritual, since stone tombs, dolmens, and tumuli lie scattered among the rows. The truth may lie between these ideas, or somewhere else entirely. Beneath one section of the alignments, archaeologists recently uncovered a monumental tomb dating to around 4,700 years before the Common Era. It was built directly on top of a much older dwelling from the Age of Hunters, as though the new world were literally rising from the foundations of the old. Fire pits surrounded the site, perhaps the remnants of communal feasting or ceremony. A local legend, far younger than the stones themselves, tells a different story. According to the people of Carnac, the standing stones are not stones at all but Roman soldiers, turned to granite by the wizard Merlin to protect the people of Brittany from invasion. The rows in this telling are a petrified army frozen at attention, still standing guard after all these centuries. The legend belongs, of course, to a much later age. The Celts, the Romans, and the Arthurian tales all lie far in the future from the people who raised these stones. What we can say is that whoever built Carnac possessed something that went beyond survival, a collective will, a shared vision, and the organizational power to move thousands of tons of rock across open ground over many generations. Beyond Carnac, megalithic culture spread across much of western France and the Atlantic seaboard. Dolmens, stone burial chambers capped with massive slabs, appeared in Poitou, the Causse, and the river valleys of the Loire. Standing menhirs rose alone in fields and on hilltops. The land was being marked, claimed, remembered. Stone became a language of permanence in a world that had known only the passing of footprints. As the millennia turned, another transformation was quietly underway. Around 1,300 years before the Common Era, the first traces of metalworking appeared in the region. Bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, began to replace stone for tools, weapons, and personal ornaments. With metal came new forms of wealth, new kinds of inequality, and new reasons for both pride and conflict. The culture of this transitional age is known as the Urnfield culture, named for its burial practice. The dead were cremated and their ashes placed in ceramic urns, then buried in flat cemeteries. The urns themselves were sometimes plain, sometimes finely decorated. Alongside them lay bronze pins, rings, and blades, their quality varying sharply between the modest graves of the common and the elaborate burials of the elite. From within this Urnfield world, around 800 years before the Common Era, a new culture began to rise. It is called the Hallstatt culture, after a site in present-day Austria, and it brought with it not only finer metalwork and mixed bronze and iron craftsmanship, but something else: long-distance trade. In the tombs of Hallstatt chieftains, archaeologists have found Greek black figure pottery, proof of commerce spanning half a continent. The gateway for much of this trade was likely Massalia, modern Marseille, a colony founded by Greek sailors from Phocia around 600 years before the Common Era. Massalia was one of the earliest true cities on French soil, a harbor where Greek olive oil and wine were exchanged for tin, amber, and furs. From the forested interior, the Greeks called the land of the Keltoi. By around 500 years before the Common Era, a vibrant new culture had taken root across much of France and Central Europe. Known as the Latin culture, its creators were the Celts, a loose family of peoples who shared languages, artistic traditions, and social structures, though they never formed a single nation or spoke with one united voice. They were farmers, warriors, craftsmen, and dreamers. The Celts built hill forts and villages, farmed the river valleys, raised cattle, and forged weapons and ornaments of breathtaking beauty. Their metalwork, swirling, abstract, alive, with interlocking curves and spirals, is among the most distinctive art produced in Europe. In a burial chamber at Vix, in northern Burgundy, a woman of high rank was laid to rest around 500 years before the Common Era, among treasures. Among her grave goods was the Vix crater, the largest known bronze vessel from the ancient world, standing over 1.5 meters tall and weighing more than 200 kilograms. It had been crafted in Greece or Magna Graecia, and carried overland across the Alps, a journey of many months, to honor a woman whose name, her story, and even her language have been entirely forgotten. The Celtic world was vibrant, restless, and fiercely independent. Its people lived in tribal communities governed by chieftains and warrior aristocracies, bound together by kinship, oath, and the spiritual authority of the Druids, priest-scholars who memorized the sacred knowledge of their people across decades of training and never once committed a word of it to writing. Their sanctuaries were not temples of cut stone, but sacred groves, clearings in the forest where light fell through the canopy of ancient oaks onto altars of rough wood and earth. The Druids taught that the soul did not perish but passed from one body to the next, and that the natural world was alive with forces that demanded attention, respect, and careful listening. But far to the south, beyond the Alps, a power was growing that would one day swallow this entire world whole. Its soldiers marched in disciplined columns. Its engineers built roads that ran straight across the landscape, and the empire they served had already begun to look northward, toward the forests and the rivers of the land it would come to call Gaul. Chapter 3: The Celts and the Coming of Rome. By the 5th century before the Common Era, the land that Rome would one day call Gaul was a world unto itself, a patchwork of Celtic tribes, each with its own chieftain, its own territory, and its own fierce sense of independence. The Celts of Gaul did not live in a single kingdom. They were divided into dozens of tribes: the Arverni in the highlands of the Massif Central, the Aedui along the Saône, the Sequani near the Jura, the Parisii on the islands of the Seine, each one governing its own lands, forming its own alliances, and nursing its own long-remembered rivalries. Their settlements ranged from scattered farmsteads to fortified hill towns known as oppida. The largest of these could hold several thousand people within ramparts of earth, timber, and stone. Inside there were workshops for metalworkers and potters, granaries for stored harvest, and open spaces where tribal councils met, and disputes were settled beneath the sky. At the heart of each tribe's governance stood not a king in the modern sense, but a council of elders, and in many communities an elected magistrate called a vergobret. Power was shared, debated, and occasionally seized by force. Alliances between tribes formed and dissolved like morning mist over the river valleys. Unity among them was rare. Independence was the abiding rule, binding these fractured communities together, at least in spirit, were the Druids. They served as priests, judges, teachers, and keepers of ancestral memory. Their training could last 20 years or more. They memorized vast stores of law, genealogy, and sacred verse, and they moved freely between tribes, settling disputes and conducting rituals that connected the living world to the unseen. Trade flowed through Gallic settlements like water through roots. Amber from the Baltic coast, tin from Cornwall, wine and painted pottery from the Mediterranean all passed through the hands of Celtic merchants and chieftains. Wealth accumulated unevenly, and with it came power. A warrior aristocracy sat atop each tribe, its standing measured in cattle, gold, feasting, and the loyalty of armed retainers. It was from this restless Celtic world that a man named Brennus emerged. Around 390 years before the Common Era, Brennus led a confederation of Senones, a Celtic people from the region of the Upper Seine, southward across the Alps and deep into the Italian peninsula. Their target was not a frontier fort or a provincial town. It was Rome. The Roman Republic was still a young power then, dominant only within central Italy. Its armies were citizen militias, brave but not yet forged into the legendary force they would later become. When the Senones fell upon them at the river Alia, just north of the city, the Roman lines broke. The road to Rome lay open and the Celts walked through it. The warriors who entered Rome found a city already half abandoned. Many citizens had fled into the countryside. Those who remained, the old, the infirm, and the senators who chose to await their fate in ceremonial dress, sat motionless in their doorways. The Celts moved through empty streets, gathering gold and grain, and setting fire to what they could not carry away. For several months, Celtic warriors held parts of the city. According to Roman tradition, only the capital hill held out, its small garrison saved. So the story goes, by the honking of sacred geese which alerted the defenders to a night attack up the cliff. The humiliation was seared into Roman memory with such force that it would not fade for centuries. Brennus is said to have uttered one of antiquity's most famous phrases. When the Romans protested that the gold weighed out for their ransom was being measured on rigged scales, Brennus threw his sword onto the balance and declared, "Woe to the vanquished." Whether or not the words are historical, their meaning echoed through everything Rome did afterward. The sack did not destroy Rome, but it transformed it. The Romans rebuilt their walls higher and thicker, they reorganized their legions, and they adopted a strategic posture that would define the centuries ahead, the conviction that safety lay not in defense alone, but in the relentless conquest of every land from which a threat might someday come. Over the next 2 centuries, Rome expanded without pause. It subdued the peoples of the Italian peninsula. It defeated the maritime empire of Carthage in 3 devastating wars. It pushed eastward into Greece and the kingdoms of Asia Minor. By the late 2nd century before the Common Era, Rome was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean world. Gaul, as the Romans understood it, was immense. It stretched from the Pyrenees to the Rhine, from the Atlantic coast to the Alps. Its great rivers, the Rhône, the Loire, the Garonne, the Seine, watered some of the richest farmland in all of Europe. Its forests were deep, and its people numerous. It was a prize that no ambitious Roman could ignore. And still the Romans remembered the Celts. They remembered the burning streets and the rigged scales. They remembered the broad-shouldered warriors who had walked unchallenged through their gates. And they looked northward, across the snow-capped passes of the Alps, toward the vast green land beyond, a land of forests, rivers, fertile soil, and tribes whose strength they had tasted once before. The first Roman move into Gaul came not as a grand invasion, but as an answer to a call for help. Around 125 years before the Common Era, the Greek city of Massalia, Rome's long-standing commercial ally on the southern coast, asked for military aid against Celtic and Ligurian tribes pressing in from the surrounding highlands. Rome answered with legions. Soldiers crossed the Alps and marched into the territory between the mountains and the Mediterranean coast. At the battles of Vindalium and along the Isere River in 121 before the Common Era, Roman forces defeated several Gallic confederations in quick succession, scattering their warriors and seizing their lands with the efficiency of long practice. From these victories, Rome carved its first province on Gallic soil, Gallia Narbonensis, named after the colonial town of Narbo, which became its capital. The province stretched across southern France, from the Alps to the Pyrenees, securing the vital overland route between Italy and Roman Spain. It was a corridor, a marketplace, and a military staging ground, all in one. Roman roads began to mark the landscape. The Via Domitia, built as early as 118 years before the Common Era, ran from Italy through the coastal lowlands to Spain, cutting through olive groves and past newly planted vineyards. Along its length one could hear Latin spoken beside Gallic tongues and see Roman stone rising beside Celtic timber for the first time. In the countryside around Narbonne, Gallic farmers began to adopt Roman methods, the careful pruning of vines, the pressing of olives, the use of heavier iron plows. Roman coins circulated in settlements that had previously relied on barter. Slowly, almost invisibly, the old ways of the interior were being reshaped by the quiet gravitational pull of a new and vastly more powerful civilization. Beyond the borders of the province, however, the great interior of Gaul remained untouched. Dozens of Celtic tribes lived as they had for generations, farming, feuding, feasting, and holding council in their hill forts. They knew the Romans were there, encamped along the southern fringe of their world. But few among them imagined what was about to come. In Rome, a man was rising whose ambitions would soon reach far beyond the comfortable borders of Narbonese Gaul. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was brilliant, deeply indebted, politically ruthless, and consumed by the kind of hunger for military glory that could make a man untouchable in the brutal arena of Roman public life. His gaze had already turned northward, and in the forests of Gaul, in the hill forts and council clearings, in the smoke of evening fires and the murmur of druid chant, the world that had endured for centuries was quietly living out its final years, though no one who sat beside those fires could yet have known it. Chapter 4, Caesar's Gaul, Conquest, Siege, and the End of the Old World. What followed was one of the most consequential military campaigns in the history of Europe. A war that would destroy the independence of Celtic Gaul, reshape the Roman Republic itself, and leave wounds across the land that would take generations to heal. In 58 years before the Common Era, a crisis on Gaul's eastern frontier gave Caesar the opening he needed. The Helvetia, a large Celtic people living in what is now Switzerland, had decided to migrate westward in great numbers, driven by growing pressure from Germanic tribes along the Upper Rhine. Their planned route would carry them through territory Rome considered its own. Caesar declared the migration unacceptable and moved with extraordinary speed. Marching his legions north from Narbonese Gaul, he intercepted the Helvetii near the town of Bibracte and defeated them in a fierce, grinding battle that lasted most of a day. The survivors were ordered to turn around and return to their homeland. But Caesar himself did not withdraw. He had seen the possibilities of Gaul, and he intended to remain. Over the months that followed, Caesar found new justifications to advance. A Germanic chieftain named Ariovistus had crossed the Rhine and was pressing deep into eastern Gaul at the invitation of feuding Celtic tribes. Caesar drove him back across the river. Then he turned his attention to the Belgae in the north, the Veneti along the Atlantic coast, and the Aquitani in the far southwest. Each campaign followed a pattern that would become familiar. Caesar would identify a threat, sometimes genuine, sometimes magnified for political advantage back in Rome, and use it to justify another advance. He exploited the rivalries between Gallic tribes with a skill that bordered on artistry, turning old allies against one another, rewarding those who cooperated, and punishing resistance with devastating force. His legions were formidable instruments. Roman soldiers marched in disciplined columns, carrying their own equipment, building fortified camps at the end of each day's advance. Their engineering capacity was as lethal as their swords. Bridges thrown across rivers in days, siege ramps raised against hilltop forts, trenches dug in patterns that turned open ground into carefully designed killing fields. At the end of each day's march, a Roman camp rose from the earth in a matter of hours. Soldiers dug ditches, raised earthen walls, and set sharpened stakes in disciplined silence. By nightfall, what had been an empty meadow became a fortified settlement with streets, command tents, and sentries posted at measured intervals along the perimeter. Even at rest, the legions were a fortress. The Gauls, for all their courage, fought at a disadvantage. Their armies were large but loosely organized, assembled from tribal levies who owed loyalty to their own chieftain rather than to any central command. They were fearsome in the charge and deadly in close combat, but they lacked the Romans' ability to sustain long campaigns, coordinate supply lines, and adapt their tactics from one engagement to the next. During the campaign, Caesar even crossed the sea. Suspecting that the tribes of Britain were providing support to Gallic resistance, he launched 2 expeditions across the English Channel, one in 55 before the Common Era and a second the following year. The crossings were dramatic but largely symbolic. Supply difficulties and unrest on the continent forced him to pull back both times. He returned to Gaul with his attention sharpened. The true crisis came in 52 years before the Common Era. After years of piecemeal submission, a young chieftain of the Arverni named Vercingetorix accomplished what no Gaul had managed before. He united the tribes. Not all of them, and not without difficulty, but enough to raise the largest coalition the Romans had yet faced. Vercingetorix was shrewd enough to avoid pitched battle where he could. He adopted a strategy of scorched earth, ordering crops and villages burned to deny the Romans their supplies, and striking at their columns with swift cavalry raids. He understood that time and hunger might accomplish what swords alone could not. For a season, the strategy worked, and Caesar's legions began to suffer. Villages that had stood for generations were set ablaze by their own people on Vercingetorix's orders. Granaries were emptied and burned. Fields of ripening wheat were trampled flat or fired. The smoke rose for days across the hills of central Gaul, visible for many miles in every direction. It was a sacrifice born of desperation, the destruction of home as a weapon of war. But the decisive moment came at Alesia, a fortified hilltop town in what is now Burgundy. Vercingetorix withdrew his forces behind its walls, expecting relief from a massive Gallic army gathering across the land. Caesar, rather than retreating, chose to lay siege, and in doing so undertook one of the most extraordinary feats of military engineering the ancient world had ever seen. Around the hill of Alesia, Caesar's soldiers built a ring of fortifications facing inward, trenches, walls, sharpened stakes, and watchtowers, to keep Vercingetorix sealed inside. Then they constructed a second ring facing outward, to defend themselves against the approaching relief army. The Romans were besieging and being besieged at the same time, enclosed within their own double wall of earth and timber. When the Gallic relief force finally arrived, the fighting was desperate. Attacks came from both directions, from the hilltop above and the open ground below. Roman soldiers fought on 2 fronts, sometimes within the same hour. At one critical point, Caesar himself led a cavalry charge to reinforce a collapsing section of the outer wall. The line held. The relief army broke and scattered. Inside the walls of Alesia, the final days had been terrible. Food had run out entirely. Women, children, and the elderly were sent through the gates in the hope that the Romans would allow them to pass. Caesar refused to let them through. They remained stranded in the open ground between the 2 armies. Germans caught between starvation and the cold indifference of both sides. Vercingetorix, with no hope of rescue remaining, rode out from the gates the following morning. According to Roman accounts, he dismounted before Caesar, laid his weapons at the conqueror's feet, and surrendered in silence. He would spend 6 years as a prisoner in Rome, be paraded through the streets during Caesar's triumph, and then be quietly executed in a cell beneath the Forum. The fall of Alesia did not end all resistance, but it broke the spine of organized Gallic opposition. In the months and years that followed, the remaining pockets of rebellion were crushed one by one. By 50 years before the Common Era, the whole of Gaul lay under Roman control, from the Rhine to the Atlantic, from the Channel coast to the foothills of the Pyrenees. The cost was staggering. Caesar himself, writing in his own account of the war, recorded figures suggesting that close to 1 million Gauls had been killed and another million enslaved. More than 800 settlements were destroyed. Even allowing for the exaggeration of a man who wished to magnify his own achievements, the devastation was vast, and its echoes would endure for generations. The exhaustion went beyond the physical. After years of war, famine, and displacement, the surviving Gallic communities longed above all else for peace and order. Chieftains who had once resisted now came forward to negotiate. The old desire for independence had not vanished, but it had been buried beneath a simpler and more urgent need, the wish at last to stop dying. For Caesar personally, the conquest was transformative. He arrived in Gaul as a debt-ridden politician seeking military prestige. He left as the most powerful man in the Roman world, commanding a battle-hardened army personally loyal to him, and possessing wealth enough to reshape the politics of the entire republic. The road from Gaul led straight to the banks of the Rubicon. In 49 years before the Common Era, faced with a Senate determined to strip him of command, Caesar led his legions across that narrow river, the legal boundary of his province. The act was illegal, irreversible, and entirely deliberate. It plunged Rome into civil war. Within 5 years, the Republic was dead, and Caesar ruled as dictator until the knives of the senators found him. For the people of Gaul, the war left a great silence. The old tribal world, its councils, its hilltop forts, its seasonal festivals, and ancient feuds had been shattered beyond recovery. The Druids, who had moved freely as keepers of law and sacred memory, would soon find themselves hunted by the power that now claimed their land. A new chapter, written entirely in Latin, was about to begin. And already, across that exhausted land, the first Roman roads were being measured, leveled, and paved, stretching outward from Narbonne like the spokes of a wheel, reaching toward a future that no Gaul had chosen, but none could any longer prevent. Chapter 5, Roman Gaul, Roads, Gods, and a New World Taking Shape. With the wars ended and the last embers of resistance fading, a long transformation began. Not the sudden imposition of a foreign order, but the slow, quiet absorption of one world into another. In 27 years before the Common Era, under the Emperor Augustus, Gaul was formally reorganized into Roman provinces. The vast territory was divided into 3 administrative regions: Aquitania in the southwest, Lugdunensis in the center and northwest, and Belgica in the north and east, each governed by a Roman-appointed official answering to the emperor in Rome. The old tribal names did not vanish overnight: the Aedui, the Arverni, the Remi. They still existed as local communities, and their elites still held influence. But the framework within which they lived had changed utterly. Power now flowed from Rome, through Latin-speaking administrators, along roads that had not existed a generation before. The world had been redrawn in stone and ink. Of all the changes that Roman rule brought to Gaul, perhaps the most enduring was language. Over several generations, the Gallic tongue, a Celtic language related to those spoken in parts of Britain and Ireland, faded from daily use. In its place spread vulgar Latin, the everyday spoken language of Roman soldiers, merchants, and officials who filled the new towns and roads. The shift was not forced at the point of a sword, but driven by practical necessity. Gallic elites who wished to participate in Roman political life, to hold office, to plead cases in Roman courts, or to trade across provincial borders found that Latin was the indispensable tool. To speak Latin was to have access to power. To lack it was to remain shut out. Yet even as Latin replaced Gallic in the marketplaces and law courts, the old language lingered in the countryside, in place names, in the names of rivers, and in words that would eventually be absorbed into the Latin that was evolving, century by century, toward something that would one day be called French. The past does not disappear so easily. It hides inside the new. The Romans brought their gods as well, and here the meeting of cultures produced something unexpected. Rather than simply erasing Gallic religion, the two traditions merged. The Gallic sky god Tyrannus was identified with Jupiter. The tribal deity Lugus was equated with Mercury. The horse goddess Epona found a place of honor in Roman cavalry barracks across the empire. Roman-style temples rose in Gallic towns, their stone columns and triangular pediments standing where wooden shrines had been. Inside, Roman and Gallic deities were sometimes worshipped side by side, their images carved in a style that was neither purely Roman nor purely Celtic. A quiet fusion born of proximity, pragmatism, and the persistent human need to make sense of the sacred. The Druids, however, were not absorbed. Rome viewed them with deep suspicion, not merely as religious leaders, but as potential rallying points for resistance. Imperial edicts targeted their practices, and organized persecution drove many into hiding. Without their guidance, the oral traditions they had preserved for centuries began to fragment and fade. A thread that had connected generations was quietly severed. What filled the spiritual silence in part was the imperial cult. Worship of the emperor as a semi-divine figure was encouraged throughout the provinces as a tool of political unity. In Lyon, Lugdunum, the capital of the Three Gauls, a grand altar was dedicated to Augustus. Each August, delegates from across the land gathered for ceremonies that bound loyalty to Rome through shared reverence. But the most visible transformation was physical. The Romans were builders on a scale Gaul had never witnessed. Aqueducts carried fresh water across entire valleys on slender arches of pale stone. Amphitheatres rose in cities from Nimes to Autun. Bathhouses offered heated rooms, cold plunge pools, and mosaic floors depicting dolphins, grapevines, and scenes drawn from mythology. The Roman city was a world unto itself. The Pont du Gard, near Nimes, still stands as a monument to this ambition. Built in the 1st century to carry water across the Gardon Valley, its 3 tiers of limestone arches rise nearly 50 meters above the river. It was part of a 50-kilometer aqueduct supplying the city with fresh water drawn from distant springs, a daily miracle of gravity, engineering, and carefully dressed stone. At the heart of every Roman town stood the Forum, an open square surrounded by colonnaded porticos, administrative halls, and temples. It was where business was conducted, justice dispensed, and public life performed. In Gaul, forums were built to the same proportions and with the same materials as their counterparts in Italy. A traveler might forget for a moment which province they stood in. Connecting these cities was a vast network of roads. Over the course of Roman rule, more than 20,000 kilometers of paved highway were laid across Gaul. The roads ran straight through forests, bridged rivers on stone arches, and climbed mountain passes with engineered switchbacks. They were built for the rapid movement of legions, but they carried everything: goods, letters, ideas, and people. Along these roads, trade flourished as never before. Ham from the Ardennes, wine from Burgundy and the Rhone Valley, tin from the northwest, fine pottery from the workshops of La Graufazenc, all moved through a commercial web that linked the smallest Gallic village to the farthest reaches of the empire. Gaul grew prosperous. Its cities expanded. Its wealthiest families built country estates with heated floors and painted walls. In the Romanized cities, daily life followed rhythms familiar across the empire. Citizens rose early, visited the bathhouse before midday, conducted business in the forum, and gathered in the afternoon for public spectacle. In the amphitheatres, gladiatorial contests and animal hunts drew crowds of thousands. The smell of roasted meat, the sound of flutes, and the roar of spectators filled the warm afternoon air. In the countryside, change came more slowly. Many Gallic farmers continued to live as their grandparents had, tending small fields and keeping livestock in the old way. But even here, Roman influence crept in: new crops, new tools, new building methods, and the steady spread of large estates worked by tenants or slaves, a pattern that would shape rural life in France for centuries to come. For more than a century after Augustus, this peace held. Historians call it the Pax Romana, and in Gaul it brought stability and growth the region had never before experienced. Towns expanded. Roads multiplied. The population rose. The memory of the old wars faded into legend, and a generation grew up that knew nothing but Roman order. Roman coins in their hands and Latin on their lips. But peace could not last forever. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire was fracturing under the weight of political turmoil, economic crisis, and relentless pressure from Germanic peoples along the Rhine and Danube frontiers. Emperors rose and fell with alarming speed. The currency was debased. Trade routes grew dangerous. The old certainties were dissolving like salt in rain. The Rhine frontier, which had once felt so secure, became a place of constant anxiety. Germanic war bands crossed the river with increasing boldness, raiding towns and farmsteads before retreating into the forests beyond. Gallic cities that had grown comfortably past their old walls now scrambled to build new fortifications, sometimes cannibalizing the stones of their own temples and monuments as building material. In 260, as the wider empire convulsed, Gaul took matters into its own hands. A Roman military commander named Postumus, charged with defending the Rhine frontier, was proclaimed emperor by his own troops. He established what historians call the Gallic Empire, a breakaway state that governed Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain independently of Rome for 14 years. Postumus defended the Rhine with skill, repelling Germanic raiders and maintaining civil order within his domain. He minted coins, appointed officials, and governed from Trier and Cologne with all the trappings of a legitimate Roman emperor. The Gallic Empire was not a rejection of Rome. It was a declaration that the provinces could protect themselves when the distant capital could no longer do so. The Gallic Empire ended in 274, when the Emperor Aurelian reconquered the western provinces and restored unity. But the episode had revealed something that would matter in the centuries ahead. That Gaul possessed its own sense of identity, its own capacity for governance, and its own readiness to act when the center could no longer hold. Meanwhile, a new faith was spreading quietly through the cities and roads of Roman Gaul. Christianity, born in the eastern provinces of the empire, had reached Gaul by the 2nd century. Its early communities were small and often persecuted. In Lyon, in 177, a group of Christians were publicly tortured and killed in the amphitheater, their suffering recorded in letters that still survive. Yet persecution did not extinguish the faith. By the 4th century, Christianity had become the official religion of the Roman Empire, and churches were rising in Gaul where pagan temples had stood. Bishops replaced magistrates as the most visible figures of authority in many towns. The old gods, Roman and Celtic alike, retreated into memory, into folklore, and into the silent names of rivers and hills. And as the empire that had laid the roads and raised the amphitheatres began at last to weaken and withdraw, it was the church, with its bishops, its scriptures, and its network of communities, that would carry the idea of civilized order forward into the uncertain and uncharted world that lay ahead. Chapter 6: The Fall and the Forge. From Rome's collapse to the Frankish dawn. The world the Romans had built in Gaul, its roads, its laws, its language, its sense of belonging to something larger, did not collapse in a single day. It frayed slowly and unevenly, like a great garment worn thin by the passage of time. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire had split into eastern and western halves, each governed by its own emperor. The eastern half, centered on Constantinople, would endure for another 1,000 years. But the western half, stretched thin across too many frontiers and weakened by decades of civil war, was steadily losing its ability to hold the edges of its world together. The Rhine had long served as the boundary between the Roman provinces and the Germanic peoples beyond. For centuries, Roman legions had patrolled its banks, manned its forts, and kept watch over the dense forests on the far side. But by the early 5th century, the legions were fewer, the forts were undermanned, and the pressure from the east was growing with each passing year. On the last night of the year 406, the Rhine froze solid. Vandals, Alans, and Suebi crossed the ice in vast numbers, sweeping past the weakened frontier defenses and pouring into Gaul. They moved south and west, burning and plundering as they went. Roman authority, already fragile, simply collapsed in their path. The border that had defined Gaul for 4 centuries was gone. The destruction was not total, nor was it the same everywhere. Some towns were sacked and emptied. Others negotiated their way to safety. In the countryside, farmers watched foreign armies pass through their fields like storms, terrifying while present, leaving silence and ruin behind. But the cumulative effect was devastating. Trade routes broke. Tax collection ceased. The infrastructure that had sustained Roman civilization began to decay. In the decades that followed, Gaul became a patchwork of competing powers. The Visigoths, who had entered the empire as foederati, allied peoples given land in exchange for military service, established a kingdom in the southwest with its capital at Toulouse. The Burgundians settled in the Rhone Valley. The Alemanni pressed in from the east, along the upper Rhine. Amidst this fragmentation, daily life in the old Roman cities continued, though in diminished form. Markets still functioned. Churches still held services. Latin was still spoken in the streets. The bishops, who had become the most stable source of authority in many towns, negotiated with the new rulers, managed food distribution, and maintained some thread of civic order in a world whose old framework was dissolving. The physical fabric of the cities was changing too. Temples fell into disuse and ruin. Aqueducts cracked and were not repaired. Streets that had once been swept and drained now filled with mud and refuse. In many towns, the population shrank inward, clustering around the church and the bishop's residence, abandoning the outer quarters to weeds and silence. The Roman city was contracting into something smaller and more defended. Among the many Germanic peoples who settled in or around Gaul, one group would prove decisive: the Franks. They had not arrived as a single invading horde, but had been present along the lower Rhine for generations, sometimes serving as Roman soldiers, sometimes raiding across the border, and gradually establishing themselves in the northeast of Gaul through slow, persistent expansion. In 476, the last emperor of the Western Roman Empire, a boy named Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by a Germanic commander named Odoacer. The act was more symbolic than dramatic. No great battle was fought, no city was burned. The machinery of empire had ceased to function, and this final removal was a quiet acknowledgement of what had been true for years. With Rome gone from the west, the question of who would control Gaul became urgent. The Visigoths held the south and the west. The Burgundians sat in the Rhone valley. Fragments of Roman administration survived in scattered pockets, governed by men who still styled themselves in the old manner. And in the northeast, the Franks were growing stronger under a new and ambitious young leader. His name was Clovis. He was the son of Childeric, a Frankish chieftain who had maintained close ties with the last Roman authorities in northern Gaul. When Childeric died around 481, Clovis inherited his father's warriors and his position. He was barely 15 years old, but he possessed a combination of military nerve, political instinct, and cold ambition that would reshape Western Europe. Clovis began by consolidating power among the rival Frankish tribes. Then he turned outward. In 486, he defeated Syagrius, the last Roman governor in northern Gaul, at the Battle of Soissons, seizing control of the territory stretching from the Somme to the Loire. It was a quiet but decisive end to the last formal trace of Roman authority on Gallic soil. The defeat of Syagrius was more than a military victory. It extinguished the last flicker of Roman governance on this side of the Alps. For the Gallo-Roman population, the Latin-speaking descendants of centuries of Roman rule, the question was no longer whether Rome would return. It was how to live in a world where Rome would never return, and where the Franks were now the masters. From Soissons, Clovis expanded in every direction. He fought the Alemanni to the east, the Visigoths to the south, and smaller Frankish rivals wherever they resisted him. His campaigns were brutal and effective, but it was a single act, not a battle, that would prove the most consequential decision of his reign, and perhaps of the entire early medieval period in Western Europe. Around 496, following a fierce battle against the Alemanni near a place called Tolbiac, Clovis converted to Catholic Christianity. According to tradition, he had promised the Christian God during the height of the fighting that he would accept baptism if granted victory. Whether the story is entirely true matters less than what followed from it. The consequences were immense and lasting. The ceremony took place in the cathedral at Reims. The bishop, Remigius, poured water over the Frankish king's bowed head, while hundreds of warriors stood watching in the candlelight. It was a moment that bound the Frankish monarchy to the Catholic Church in a partnership that would define the politics of France for more than 1,000 years. The echoes of that baptism reached far beyond the cathedral walls. What made the conversion so significant was its nature. Other Germanic kings had adopted Arian Christianity, a form of the faith the Roman Church considered heretical. Clovis chose Catholicism, the faith of the bishops, the faith of the Gallo-Roman majority he now ruled. In a single gesture, he gained their loyalty, their administrative expertise, and the moral backing of the most powerful institution still standing in the West. The bishops of Gaul, who had spent decades navigating between barbarian rulers and the memory of a vanished empire, found themselves allied with the strongest king in Western Europe. They offered Clovis their counsel, their literacy, and their networks. In return, he offered them protection, land, and royal patronage. Church and crown leaned upon each other, and both grew stronger in the leaning. In 507, Clovis marched south against the Visigoths. At the Battle of Vouillé, near Poitiers, his forces shattered the Visigothic army and killed their king, Alaric II, in the fighting. The victory drove the Visigoths out of nearly all of Gaul and into Spain, leaving the Franks in control of a territory that stretched from the Rhine to the Pyrenees. By the time of his death in 511, Clovis ruled the largest and most powerful successor state to have risen from the rubble of the Western Roman Empire. He made Paris his capital, a city that was then still modest, clustered on an island in the Seine, surrounded by fields and forest, but sitting at the crossroads of the kingdom's rivers and roads. Paris in that age was not yet the splendid city it would become. Its houses were low, its streets were narrow, and its grandest building was a church. But Clovis had seen what others overlooked, that this quiet island at the heart of a river network could anchor a new kind of power. The choice would prove one of the most consequential in all of French history. The dynasty Clovis founded is known as the Merovingians, named after a semi-legendary ancestor called Merovec. It was a dynasty forged not from ancient royal lineage, but from the marriage of military force, political cunning, and a religious conversion that gave it legitimacy in the eyes of everyone it ruled, Frankish warrior and Gallo-Roman bishop alike. But even as the Merovingian kingdom took shape, its future was shadowed by a custom that would prove both its nature and its curse. Among the Franks, a dead king's realm was not passed intact to a single heir. It was divided among his sons, like land, like cattle, like any other possession. And Clovis left behind 4 sons, each of them ambitious, each already watching the others. The kingdom that had been so carefully assembled was about to be carved apart, and the long cycle of division, rivalry, and violent reunification that followed would define the Frankish world for the next 2 centuries, shaping not only what France would become, but the very idea of what a European kingdom could be. Chapter 7. Lazy Kings and Iron Hammers. The Merovingian Twilight and the Rise of the Carolingians. The kingdom Clovis built was powerful, but it carried within it a flaw that no amount of military strength could mend. The Frankish custom of dividing a dead king's realm among all his sons. When Clovis died in 511, his Theuderic, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clotaire carved the kingdom into portions. Each claimed his share of lands, cities, and revenues. What had been a single realm became 4 rival courts, each watching the others with suspicion, each poised to strike whenever opportunity appeared. The brothers did not wait long. Within a generation, the Merovingian royal family had become a theater of betrayal. Clotaire fell in a campaign against the Burgundians. His young sons were murdered by their own uncles, Clotaire and Childebert, who divided his lands between themselves. Among the Merovingians, blood and inheritance were bound together from the start. Of the 4 brothers, Clotaire proved the most patient and the most ruthless. Through war, treachery, and the convenient deaths of rivals, he absorbed the territories of each sibling over the decades. By 558, he ruled a reunited Frankish kingdom, the sole surviving son of Clovis, standing alone atop a mountain of family graves. Yet the pattern did not break. When Clotaire himself died in 561, his kingdom was once again split among his 4 sons. And so it continued, generation after generation, a cycle of partition, rivalry, civil war, and eventual reunification, each round weakening the monarchy a little further and strengthening the regional powers that circled beneath the throne. Out of this turbulence, 3 distinct Frankish subkingdoms gradually took shape. Neustria in the west, with Paris at its heart. Austrasia in the east, anchored along the Meuse and Moselle rivers, and Burgundy in the south, occupying the valleys of the Saône and Rhône. Each developed its own aristocracy, its own fierce loyalties, and its own political center of gravity. The rivalries between these sub-kingdoms were savage and deeply personal. The feud between Queen Fredegund of Neustria and Queen Brunhild of Austrasia consumed the late 6th century in a spiral of assassination, torture, and open war that reads less like political history and more like a blood-soaked saga. Entire courts were drawn into their hatred, and the violence they unleashed scarred a generation. By the early 7th century, the Merovingian kings found themselves increasingly dependent on their nobles. In 614, King Clotaire II issued the Edict of Paris, granting sweeping concessions to the aristocracy. Local lords gained greater authority over their own domains. The church received new guarantees of independence. The crown yielded ground it would never recover. At the center of the shifting power stood a figure originally meant to serve the king, the mayor of the palace. What had begun as a household steward's post had evolved into the highest executive office of the realm. The mayor managed royal estates, commanded armies, and brokered deals among the nobility. In all but name, the mayor was becoming the true ruler of the Franks. In practice, the mayor controlled access to the king himself. He decided which petitions reached the royal ear, which nobles received patronage, and which armies marched. The king, sealed away in a rural palace, was brought out only for ceremonies, carried in an ox cart to lend ancient legitimacy to decisions he had not made and could not have reversed even if he wished. The last Merovingian to wield genuine power was Dagobert I, who ruled with vigor until his death in 639. After him came a succession of kings whom later chroniclers would call the do-nothing kings. Rulers who wore the crown but held no authority passed from estate to estate like relics, while the mayors governed the realm in their silent name. Among the families competing for the office of mayor, one rose above the rest: the Pippinids, later known as the Carolingians. In 687, Pepin of Herstal, the Austrasian mayor, defeated his Neustrian and Burgundian rivals at the Battle of Tertry and became the undisputed master of the entire Frankish world. The king remained on the throne, but now only as a shadow. Pepin of Herstal held the kingdom together until his death in 714, but his succession was violently contested, and power passed, after a period of bitter struggle, to his illegitimate son, a young warrior named Charles. History would remember him as Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, and his name would echo far beyond the borders of the Frankish realm. Charles Martel's early years were shaped by exile, imprisonment, and constant danger. He fought his way to dominance through a series of campaigns against rival factions within the Frankish lands. By 718, at the age of roughly 30, he stood as the sole mayor of the palace and the effective ruler of the Franks. Though no crown rested on his head, Charles saw clearly what others merely feared. If the Muslim advance northward from Iberia was not halted, the Frankish kingdom, and with it the Christian order of Western Europe, would face an existential threat. To build an army capable of standing against mounted Islamic cavalry, he needed warriors on horseback, trained and equipped for heavy combat, and to equip them, he needed land. To meet this need, Charles reshaped Frankish military organization through a system called the benefice. He granted estates, often confiscated from the church, to loyal warriors, who in return owed him mounted military service. It was not yet the full feudal order of later centuries, but it was the ancestor of that order, a framework of land, loyalty, and obligation that would define medieval Europe for generations. Since 711, Muslim forces had swept across the Iberian Peninsula, toppling the Visigothic kingdom in barely 5 years. Their advance did not stop at the Pyrenees. Raiding columns penetrated deep into southern Gaul, reaching Burgundy and the Loire Valley. The speed and discipline of the Islamic expansion sent a tremor of genuine fear through the Christian kingdoms of the West. The system Charles built bore its greatest fruit in October of 732, near the city of Tours. A large Muslim army, having sacked Bordeaux and driven deep into the heart of Gaul, was met by Charles and his Frankish forces on a broad stretch of ground between Tours and Poitiers. The encounter lasted several days before the decisive clash came. The Frankish infantry held its line in a dense, disciplined formation. The Muslim cavalry, which had carried all before it across Iberia and southern Gaul, charged again and again, but could not break through. When the Muslim commander, Abd al-Rahman, was killed in the fighting, the army's cohesion shattered. By the following dawn, the invaders had retreated southward, leaving their dead upon the field. The field after the battle was covered with the fallen. The autumn air was sharp and still. Frankish soldiers moved among the dead, collecting weapons and armor, while monks from nearby monasteries murmured prayers over the bodies. The banners of the retreating army could still be glimpsed in the far distance, growing smaller against the gray horizon to the south. The Battle of Tours did not end the Muslim presence in southern France entirely. Raids would continue for years, but it marked the outermost limit of Islamic territorial expansion into Western Europe. For Charles, the victory elevated him from a powerful warlord to a figure of almost legendary stature. He was hailed as the savior of Christendom, the hammer that had stopped an unstoppable force. Charles Martel died in 741, dividing his authority between two sons, Carloman and Pepin. Within a decade, Carloman had withdrawn to a monastery, perhaps by choice, perhaps under pressure, and Pepin III stood alone as ruler of the Franks. But Pepin wanted more than the power behind the throne. He wanted the throne itself. In 751, with the blessing of the Pope, Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king, the hapless Childeric III, and had himself anointed king of the Franks at Soissons. The dynasty that Clovis had founded nearly 3 centuries before was extinguished. A new dynasty, the Carolingians, took its place, built not on inheritance alone, but on power, patience, and the quiet approval of Rome. And it was the son of this new king, a boy already showing signs of extraordinary will and appetite for greatness, who would carry the Carolingian name further than anyone yet imagined, to the very walls of Rome and the title of emperor. His name was Charles. The world would come to call him Charlemagne. Chapter 8. Charlemagne, the crown of Europe. No single life shaped early medieval Europe more profoundly than that of the man remembered as Charlemagne, Charles the Great, a king who dreamed not merely of ruling a kingdom, but of restoring an empire. Pepin III died in 768, and his realm was divided, as Frankish custom required, between his 2 sons, Charles and Carloman. The brothers shared little beyond a name and a deep mutual distrust. For 3 uneasy years they ruled side by side. Then, in 771, Carloman died suddenly. Charles seized his brother's territories without hesitation. From the moment he stood alone, Charles moved with extraordinary energy. He was tall. Contemporaries described him as towering above most men, with a powerful frame, a commanding voice, and an appetite for both war and learning that never seemed to diminish. He would spend the next 4 decades in nearly continuous campaign, yet he never lost his fascination with books, law, and the life of the mind. His first great conquest was the Lombard kingdom of northern Italy. In 774, answering an appeal from Pope Hadrian I, Charles led his army across the Alps and besieged the Lombard capital of Pavia. The city fell after months of blockade. Charles claimed the Iron Crown of Lombardy for himself and added the title King of the Lombards to his growing list of honors. He turned next to the Saxons, a pagan Germanic people living east of the Rhine, who had resisted Frankish authority for generations. The Saxon wars would last off and on for more than 30 years. They were marked by forced conversions, mass deportations, and episodes of extreme violence, including the execution of thousands of Saxon captives at Verdun in 782. The Saxon campaigns revealed a harsher dimension of Charlemagne's ambition. His determination to bring the Saxons into the Christian fold was not merely strategic. It was driven by a conviction that the expansion of the faith justified extraordinary measures. The Saxons resisted bitterly, led at times by a chieftain named Widukind, who became a symbol of defiance before finally submitting to baptism. Beyond the Saxons, Charles extended Frankish dominion into Bavaria, absorbed in 788, and deep into the lands of the Avars along the Middle Danube, whose great ring fortress he dismantled and whose treasury, centuries of accumulated plunder, he distributed among his followers. The wealth was so vast, it was said, that 15 ox carts were needed to carry it away from the field. In the south, Charlemagne's reach met its limit. A campaign into Muslim-held Spain in 778 ended in retreat, and as his rear guard crossed back through the Pyrenean passes, it was ambushed and destroyed at Roncevaux. Among the fallen was a nobleman named Roland, whose death would be immortalized centuries later in the great epic poem that bears his name. By the close of the 8th century, Charlemagne ruled a realm stretching from the North Sea to central Italy, from the Atlantic coast of Brittany to the Danube plains. No Western ruler had commanded so vast a territory since the fall of Rome, and it was precisely that comparison with Rome that shaped the extraordinary event which came next. On Christmas Day in the year 800, inside the Basilica of St. Peter in Rome, Pope Leo III placed a golden crown upon the head of the kneeling Frankish king. Charles rose as Emperor of the Romans, the first man to hold that title in the West since the fall of Romulus Augustulus more than 3 centuries before. The congregation roared its acclamation. Whether Charlemagne expected the coronation or was genuinely startled, he later claimed displeasure. The act carried immense symbolic weight. It declared that the Western Roman Empire had been reborn, that its center was now in the Frankish north rather than in Italy, and that the bond between the papacy and the Frankish crown had become the political bedrock of Western Christendom. Charlemagne's legacy was not only military. Alongside his conquests, he pursued a program of cultural renewal that historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. He gathered scholars from across Europe, Alcuin of York, Theodulf of Orléans, Paul the Deacon of Italy, and tasked them with reforming education, standardizing worship, and preserving the literary inheritance of the ancient world. At the heart of this effort was the written word. Monasteries were directed to copy manuscripts, works of theology, grammar, history, and classical Roman literature, onto fresh parchment in a clear new script called Carolingian minuscule. Many ancient texts survive today solely because Carolingian monks copied them during this period. Without their patient labor, much of the classical world would have been lost forever. Charlemagne himself, it was said, kept writing tablets beside his bed and practiced forming letters late into the night, though he never fully mastered the craft. He loved having books read aloud at meals. Augustine's City of God was a favorite, and he insisted that schools be established in every cathedral and major monastery across the empire. His capital at Aachen in what is now Western Germany became the center of this world. He built a great palace chapel there, an octagonal stone structure modeled on the imperial churches of Ravenna, and filled it with marble columns, mosaics, and holy relics carried north from Italy. The chapel still stands, a quiet testament to a man who believed that power and learning were inseparable. Aachen was more than a palace. It was a small universe. Scholars debated theology in its courtyards. Scribes bent over manuscripts in candlelit workshops. Engineers maintained the thermal baths that Charlemagne loved, for he was a devoted swimmer, even in old age. Guests were often invited to join him in the warm waters. The court hummed with the restless energy of a mind that refused to be still. Charlemagne governed his empire through a network of counts, royal appointees who administered justice, collected revenues, and raised armies in the provinces. To keep them honest, he dispatched traveling inspectors called missi dominici, who rode in pairs across the realm, auditing local governance and reporting directly to the emperor. The system was imperfect, but for its age, it was remarkably effective. Charlemagne died on the 28th of January, 814, at Aachen. He was in his early 70s, an extraordinary age for the era. According to his biographer Einhard, his body was dressed in imperial robes and seated upright on a throne in the crypt of his chapel, with a gospel book open in his lap and a golden crown upon his bowed head. His sole surviving son, Louis the Pious, inherited the empire intact. Louis was devout, thoughtful, and deeply committed to preserving unity. In 817, he issued a decree declaring that the empire would not be divided, but would pass whole to his eldest son, Lothar, who would hold supreme authority while his younger brothers ruled subordinate kingdoms beneath him. The plan was noble, but it was fragile. When a fourth son, Charles, was born to Louis's second wife, the emperor revised the succession, and the older brothers revolted. What followed was more than a decade of civil war, betrayal, and shifting alliances that tore the Carolingian family apart and exhausted the empire's already strained resources and authority. The Civil War consumed an entire generation. Fields that should have been sown lay fallow. Churches that had been centers of learning became bargaining chips in disputes between rival factions. The dream that Charlemagne had embodied of a united Christian empire governed by a single strong hand could not survive the ambitions of his own grandsons. What remained were fragments, each now seeking its own way forward. Louis the Pious died in 840, worn out by the struggle. The fighting continued among his sons until in 843 the three survivors, Lothar, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, gathered at Verdun and signed a treaty that divided the empire into three parts. It was a moment of exhausted finality, agreed upon by weary men in a quiet room. Lothar received the central corridor, a long, narrow strip running from the North Sea through the Rhineland and into Italy, along with the imperial title. Louis the German took the eastern lands, the territory that would become Germany, and Charles the Bald received the western portion, the realm that would, over the slow turning of centuries, evolve into France. The Treaty of Verdun did not feel, to those who signed it, like the birth of nations. It was a pragmatic division of exhausted lands among exhausted brothers. But the lines drawn that day would prove durable. The political geography of Europe, France in the west, Germany in the east, and the disputed borderlands between them, was being sketched in rough early form at a table in Verdun. The great empire that Charlemagne had built was gone, but the idea of it, the dream of a unified Christian Europe, governed by law, sustained by learning, and crowned by Rome, would haunt the continent for 1,000 years. And in the western fragment of that shattered realm, something new and enduring was quietly beginning to take root. Chapter 9. Vikings, Normans, and the birth of the Capetians. The empire Charlemagne had built was gone, divided at Verdun, and crumbling further with each passing decade. And into the widening cracks of the Carolingian order, from the cold seas of the north, came the Vikings. They arrived in long, shallow draughted ships, oak-hulled vessels with carved prows that could navigate both open ocean and shallow river alike. The first raids on Frankish shores came in the late 8th century, striking coastal monasteries, seizing silver, livestock, and captives, then vanishing before any defense could be mustered. By the 9th century, the raids had become something closer to invasions. The longship was a marvel of northern craftsmanship. Its hull was clinker-built, overlapping planks of oak riveted together and sealed with animal hair and tar. It drew so little water that it could be beached on any shore or rowed far upriver, past towns and forts built to guard against threats arriving by road. Against an enemy that came by water, the old defenses were nearly useless. The Vikings who struck France were mostly Norsemen from Denmark and Norway, farmers, traders, and warriors in equal measure. They followed the rivers inland with terrifying ease. The Seine, the Loire, the Garonne, waterways that had once carried Roman commerce now carried long ships deep into the heart of the kingdom. No town along a navigable river could consider itself safe. Paris itself was besieged in 845, when a Viking fleet sailed up the Seine and extracted a vast ransom from the Carolingian king, Charles the Bald. It was the first of many humiliations. The Frankish crown, weakened by internal division and the endless subdivision of its territories, could mount no consistent defense against a threat that struck everywhere and lingered nowhere. The most dramatic test came in 885, when a massive Viking force, hundreds of ships carrying thousands of warriors, appeared before the walls of Paris and laid siege to the city. The attack lasted nearly a year. Paris was then centered on the Île de la Cité, a fortified island in the Seine, and its bridges controlled all passage upriver. The defense was led not by the Carolingian king, but by a local nobleman, Odo, Count of Paris, a member of the rising Robertian family that would later become the House of Capet. Odo fought with conspicuous courage, rallying the garrison through months of assault, disease, and hunger. The siege made his name and laid bare the crown's inability to protect its own capital. When Emperor Charles the Fat finally arrived with a relief army, he chose not to fight but to pay, offering the Vikings silver and granting them passage upriver to plunder Burgundy instead. The decision was met with fury. Within 2 years, Charles the Fat had been deposed. Odo was elevated to the throne, the first non-Carolingian king of the Western Franks. The failure of the Carolingian kings to defend the realm had consequences far beyond Viking raids. Across the kingdom, local lords built their own castles, raised their own militias, and governed their territories with little deference to the crown. Power, which had once flowed from the king outward, was now rooted in the land itself, held by whoever had the walls and the armed men to keep it. Odo's reign was contested by Carolingian loyalists, and after his death the crown passed back and forth between the two rival families for nearly a century. The Robertians would hold the throne, then lose it, then gain it again, each time growing stronger in land and influence, while the Carolingian line weakened with every generation, its territories shrinking, its authority fading. Meanwhile, a quiet transformation was underway in the lower Seine Valley. A Viking chieftain named Rollo, a man of great ambition and practical intelligence, had been raiding the region for years. But as Frankish defenses tightened and easy plunder grew scarce, Rollo began to consider a different kind of future, one built not on raids, but on permanent settlement and legitimate rule. In 911, Rollo and King Charles the Simple reached an agreement known as the Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte. Under its terms, Rollo received the lands around the lower Seine and its estuary, roughly the area that would become Normandy, the land of the Northmen. In return, he agreed to defend the coast against other Viking raiders and to accept Christian baptism. The bargain held. Rollo and his descendants proved remarkably adept at governing. Within 2 or 3 generations, the Normans had adopted French as their language, embraced Christianity, built stone castles and fine churches, and transformed their territory into one of the most efficiently ruled domains in all of Western Europe. The raiders had become lords, and their duchy would one day change the fate of England. In the heartland of the Western Frankish kingdom, the Carolingian dynasty was nearing its end. Power lay with the great regional lords, the Dukes of Normandy, Aquitaine, and Burgundy, the Counts of Flanders, Anjou, and Champagne, each governing territories far larger and wealthier than the thin strip of land the king directly controlled around Paris and the Ile-de-France. The end came quietly. In 987, the last Carolingian king of the Western Franks, Louis V, died after a brief and unremarkable reign. He was barely 20 and left no heir. The great nobles gathered to choose a successor, and their choice fell not on a distant Carolingian cousin, but on Hugh Capet, Duke of Francigia and descendant of Odo, the defender of Paris. The coronation took place at Reims, the same cathedral where Clovis had been baptized 5 centuries before. By crowning Hugh at Reims, the ceremony wrapped the new dynasty in the oldest and most sacred tradition of Frankish kingship. The holy oil, the murmur of bishops, the cold weight of the crown, all was designed to give this untested ruler an authority his lands alone could not provide. Hugh Capet's election proved one of the most consequential events in French history. He founded a dynasty, the Capetians, that would rule France in one branch or another for more than 800 years. Every subsequent king of France, through revolution and restoration alike, traced his lineage back to this quiet, pragmatic man who took the crown in a time of doubt and held it with patience. The Ile-de-France, the Capetian heartland, was small but well placed. Paris sat at the junction of the Seine and several tributaries, commanding trade routes running north to Flanders, south to the Loire, and east toward Champagne. The royal abbeys of Saint-Denis and Sainte-Geneviève lent the dynasty spiritual prestige. What the early Capetians lacked in military power, they made up for in geography, symbolism, and stubborn endurance. Hugh's strategy was simple and effective. Rather than challenge his powerful vassals directly, he worked to ensure the crown passed from father to son. He had his own son, Robert, crowned as co-king during his lifetime, a practice that prevented the noble assembly from choosing a rival and guaranteed continuity. The Capetians would repeat this tactic for generations, building dynasty where the Carolingians had allowed drift. Wands. The early Capetian kings were not conquerors, they were survivors, men who governed a small domain in a kingdom of giants, who built alliances through marriage and diplomacy, who cultivated the church as their closest partner, and who understood that the slow accumulation of authority, generation by generation, was worth more than any single victory on the battlefield. By the close of the 11th century, the Capetians had survived their fragile beginning. The crown had passed from father to son for 4 generations unbroken. The church, grateful for royal protection, had become the monarchy's most reliable support. And across the kingdom, a restless energy was stirring, in the growing towns, in a rising population, and in a religious fervor that would soon carry French knights to Jerusalem. It was a modest beginning for a dynasty, but from that modesty, something extraordinary would grow. A kingdom that would, across the coming centuries, transform itself from a loose collection of feudal territories into the most powerful and most centralized state in all of medieval Europe. That transformation, however, would require patience, cunning, and a great deal of time. Chapter 10. The Capetian Century. Crusades, cathedrals, and the making of France. The early Capetians had survived. Now, across the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, their descendants would accomplish something far more remarkable. They would slowly, methodically, and sometimes ruthlessly transform a fragile kingdom into the strongest state in Christendom. The first Capetian kings ruled more in name than in reality. Hugh Capet's son, Robert the Pious, spent decades struggling to discipline even the petty lords within a day's ride of Paris. Robber barons built castles on hilltops and extracted tolls from passing merchants with impunity. The king could issue proclamations and dispatch letters, but enforcing them beyond his own modest domain required power he did not yet possess. At the Council of Clermont in 1095, Pope Urban II stood before a vast assembly and delivered a call that would reshape the history of Europe. He urged the knights and lords of Christendom to march eastward, liberate the holy city of Jerusalem from Muslim control, and reclaim the sacred sites of the faith. The crowd roared its approval with a single cry, "God wills it." The response was extraordinary. Across France, thousands of men, from great lords to landless younger sons, sewed crosses onto their cloaks and set out for the east. The First Crusade drew more heavily from French territory than from any other part of Europe. French-speaking knights formed the core of the crusading host, and it was they who stormed the walls of Jerusalem in 1099. The capture of Jerusalem sent a tremor of elation through the Christian world. Crusader states were established along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, many governed by French-speaking nobles who recreated the feudal structures of their homeland amid the dry hills and olive groves of the Levant. Back in France, the Crusades had a subtler but equally lasting effect. The departure of so many powerful nobles created space for the crown to consolidate its position at home. While the lords were away fighting in distant lands, the king could resolve disputes, absorb vacant estates, and strengthen the network of royal courts and officials that would slowly become the tendons of centralized power. The king who turned these opportunities into permanent advantage was Philip II, known as Philip Augustus. He came to the throne in 1180, a sickly, cautious teenager ruling a domain still confined to the Île-de-France. By the time of his death in 1223, he had quadrupled the royal domain and made the French monarchy the strongest in Europe. Philip's great adversary was the Angevin dynasty of England. The Plantagenet kings, who, through marriage and inheritance, controlled not only England but enormous swaths of western France, from Normandy and Anjou down through Aquitaine to the Pyrenees. On paper, these English-held territories were fiefs of the French crown. In reality, the Plantagenets governed them independently, and their combined power dwarfed that of the king in Paris. Philip dismantled the Angevin Empire with patience and political skill. He exploited the quarrels between the English king Henry II and his rebellious sons. He played Richard the Lionheart and John against each other with care, and when John lost the loyalty of his Norman vassals, Philip struck, seizing Normandy, Anjou, and the Plantagenet heartland in a series of campaigns around 1204. The decisive confirmation came at the Battle of Bouvines in 1214. Philip faced a powerful coalition: the Holy Roman Emperor Otto IV, King John of England, and the Count of Flanders, all united against him. On a July afternoon in the fields near Lille, The French army shattered this alliance in a single fierce engagement that lasted only hours, but echoed for generations. Bouvines was more than a military triumph. It was one of the earliest moments when the idea of France, as a country, as a community bound by shared loyalty, began to take visible shape. When news of the victory reached Paris, the city erupted in week-long celebrations. For the first time, something resembling national pride could be felt not only among the nobility, but among ordinary people. The 12th and 13th centuries witnessed a remarkable intellectual flowering alongside these political changes. The University of Paris, established around 1150, became the foremost center of learning in Europe. Scholars gathered in the Latin Quarter to study theology, philosophy, and law. Peter Abelard had debated logic in its early halls. Thomas Aquinas would later compose his great synthesis of faith and reason within its walls. Philip's grandson, Louis IX, later canonized as St. Louis, inherited a kingdom profoundly strengthened. He ruled from 1226 to 1270 and became the most admired monarch in Christendom, devout, just, and deeply serious. Louis embodied the medieval ideal of the Christian king, a ruler whose authority rested not on force alone but on the example of a moral life. St. Louis reformed the royal courts and established inspectors to check abuses by local officials. He sat personally beneath an oak tree in the forest of Vincennes to hear the grievances of common subjects. He banned trial by combat in royal domains and promoted written evidence and reasoned inquiry in legal proceedings. In his reign, justice began to look less like a lord's caprice and more like a system. He led 2 crusades, the 7th, which ended in disaster and his own capture in Egypt in 1250, and the 8th, during which he died of illness outside Tunis in 1270. His death on crusade deepened his reputation for holiness. He was canonized by the Church in 1297, and his memory cast a long golden shadow over the French monarchy for generations to come. While kings fought and reformed, another ambition was rising across the land, an ambition expressed not in armies but in stone. Beginning in the middle of the 12th century, a revolutionary new style of building appeared in the Île-de-France, one that would come to be known as Gothic. It was unlike anything Europe had ever seen, and it would define the visual identity of medieval France. The Gothic cathedral was an engineering miracle disguised as a prayer. Pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses allowed builders to raise walls to extraordinary heights and pierce them with vast windows of colored glass. Light poured into spaces that had once been dark and heavy. The effect was deliberately overwhelming, designed to make the visitor feel upon entering that they had stepped through a doorway into heaven. The great cathedrals rose across northern France like a slow-moving wave. Notre Dame de Paris was begun in 1163. Chartres was rebuilt after a devastating fire in 1194. Reims, where every king was crowned, was reconstructed from 1211. Amiens, the tallest of all, reached skyward from 1220. Each city competed with its neighbors in height, in radiance, and in the beauty of its carved stone portals. These were not the projects of kings alone. They were collective acts, funded by bishops and guilds, by the offerings of thousands of ordinary people. The construction of a single cathedral could span a century or more. Generations of masons, Glaziers and carpenters labored upon structures they would never see completed. The cathedrals were prayers measured not in words but in lifetimes of patient, anonymous work. Beneath the soaring stone, the kingdom itself was expanding. The population of France roughly doubled between the 10th and 13th centuries. New towns appeared along trade routes. Weekly markets drew farmers from the surrounding countryside. Mills multiplied along every river. Roads improved. The tempo of medieval life was quickening, and the wealth generated by this growth flowed in part upward toward a crown that was learning to use it. The last of the direct Capetian line was Philip IV, Philip the Fair, who reigned from 1285 to 1314. He was intelligent, secretive, and utterly relentless in the pursuit of royal authority. He clashed with the papacy, taxed the clergy, and in 1307 ordered the arrest of the Knights Templar, the wealthy military order whose destruction filled royal coffers and eliminated a dangerous rival. Philip pressured the Pope into dissolving the Templar order and relocating the papacy from Rome to Avignon in southern France, where it would remain under French influence for nearly 70 years. It was a stunning assertion of royal supremacy over the Church, an inversion of the relationship that had defined European politics since the time of Clovis and Charlemagne 7 centuries before. Philip the Fair died in 1314, and within the span of 14 years, all 3 of his sons followed him to the grave, each without a surviving male heir. The direct Capetian line, which had passed the crown from father to son without interruption for more than 3 centuries, was extinguished. The throne passed to a cousin, Philip of Valois, and a new dynasty took its place. But the question of succession would not rest quietly. Across the Channel, King Edward III of England, grandson of Philip the Fair through his mother, believed he held an equal or superior claim to the French throne. The dispute would not be resolved by lawyers or by diplomats. It would be settled by armies across more than 100 years of war. And so the long Capetian peace came to its close, not with a whisper, but with the distant sound of bowstrings tightening across the Channel, and the first tremor of an English army preparing to cross the sea toward French soil. Chapter 11. The 100 Years' War, Plague, Fire, and the Maid of Orleans. What followed was not a single war, but a century of intermittent conflict. A grinding generational struggle between France and England that would devastate the land, shatter the old feudal certainties, and forge something entirely new from the ruins. A French nation. When the last direct Capetian king died without a male heir in 1328, the French nobility chose Philip of Valois to succeed him. But Edward III of England, whose mother was the daughter of Philip the Fair, believed the throne should have been his. The dispute smoldered for nearly a decade before it erupted into open war in 1337. The early years of the conflict brought catastrophe for France. At Crécy in 1346, a French army of knights, the finest heavy cavalry in Europe, charged uphill into a storm of English arrows. The longbow, drawn by common soldiers standing in disciplined ranks, cut through the flower of French chivalry with a violence that stunned the continent. France lost thousands of men in a single afternoon. The disaster at Crécy was compounded by a horror no army could fight. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Europe aboard merchant ships from the east. The plague swept across France with terrifying speed, killing perhaps a third of the population within 4 years. Entire villages were emptied. Fields lay unharvested. The living could barely bury the dead, and the air smelled of nothing but ash and decay. The plague recurred in waves for the rest of the century, each return stripping away another layer of the fragile social order. Labor became scarce and therefore valuable. Peasants who survived found themselves in a changed world, one where their work was worth more, their patience was thinner, and the old feudal obligations felt less like sacred duty and more like intolerable burden. A decade after Crécy, the English struck again. At Poitiers in 1356, an English force under the Black Prince, Edward's eldest son, defeated a much larger French army and captured King John II on the field. It was a humiliation without precedent. The King of France was led away in chains, and the ransom demanded for his release nearly bankrupted the kingdom. France descended into chaos. The Estates General, summoned to raise the ransom, became a theater of political revolt. Peasant uprisings, the Jacquerie, erupted across the countryside, fueled by anger at taxes, at the nobility's failure to protect them, and at a war that seemed to benefit no one but the English and the lords who profited from disorder. The kingdom felt as though it might tear itself apart. A fragile recovery followed under Charles V, who reformed the military, rebuilt the treasury, and clawed back much of the territory lost in the first phase of the war. For a generation, France steadied itself. But when his son, Charles VI, succumbed to recurring bouts of madness, the kingdom was plunged once more into factional war between the Armagnac and Burgundian parties. The English seized their chance. In 1415, King Henry V of England landed in Normandy and marched his army toward Calais. At Agincourt, on a rain-soaked field of freshly plowed mud, a small English force annihilated a French army many times its size. Once again, the longbow proved devastating against mounted knights struggling through heavy ground. The defeat was shattering, both militarily and psychologically. In the aftermath, the Burgundian faction allied openly with England. The Treaty of Troyes in 1420 effectively disinherited the French Dauphin, the future Charles VII, and recognized Henry V as heir to the French throne. When both Henry and the mad Charles VI died within months of each other in 1422, an infant English king was proclaimed ruler of both England and France. The Dauphin, Charles, retreated south of the Loire, clinging to a diminished court and a diminishing hope. Northern France, including Paris, was under English or Burgundian control. The kingdom was fractured, demoralized, and seemingly beyond rescue. Those who still believed in a French future had little to sustain them, but stubbornness and faith. It was into this darkness that a figure emerged so improbable that her story has never entirely ceased to astonish. In 1429, a peasant girl from the village of Domremy, in the borderlands of Lorraine, appeared at the Dauphin's court and declared that heavenly voices had commanded her to drive the English from France and see the Dauphin crowned at Rennes. Her name was Jeanne. She was 17 years old, illiterate, and possessed of a conviction so absolute that it unnerved everyone who encountered her. Against all logic, the desperate Dauphin gave her a suit of white armor, a banner, and a place in the army, marching to relieve the besieged city of Orléans. What happened next altered the course of the war. Jeanne arrived at Orléans in late April and, within 9 days, had reversed 6 months of English advantage. The siege was broken. The English withdrew. The news spread across France like wildfire. and the effect on national morale was electric. A figure who had been dismissed as a madwoman or a fraud was suddenly hailed as a savior, a sign that God had not abandoned France after all. Weeks later, riding the momentum, Jean escorted the Dauphin through English-held territory to Reims, where he was crowned Charles VII in the ancient cathedral, the same church where Clovis had been baptized and where every French king since had received the sacred oil. The coronation restored the legitimacy of the Valois line and gave the French cause a symbolic center it had desperately lacked. Jean's fortune did not last. She was captured by Burgundian forces in 1430, sold to the English, and subjected to an ecclesiastical trial on charges of heresy and witchcraft. The court that judged her was hostile from the start. Charles VII, who owed her his crown, made no effort to rescue her. In 1431, she was burned at the stake in Rouen. She was 19 years old. The English expected her death to extinguish French resistance. Instead, it deepened it. Jean became a martyr, a symbol of sacrifice and national devotion that no military defeat could erase. French resolve hardened. The tide of the war, which had turned at Orléans, continued to shift. In 1435, the Burgundians abandoned their English alliance and signed the Treaty of Arras, reuniting with the French crown. Over the following 2 decades, French armies, reorganized, better equipped, and newly confident, steadily recaptured the territories that had been lost. Town by town, province by province, the English were pushed back. Normandy fell in 1450. Aquitaine followed. In 1453, the French victory at the Battle of Castillon near Bordeaux effectively ended the war. England retained only the port of Calais. The 100 Years' War had lasted 116 years. Its cost was beyond reckoning. Millions dead from combat, famine, and plague. The countryside was scarred by decades of burning and destruction. Entire regions had been emptied. Towns that had once held thousands now stood as hollow shells, their markets silent, their church roofs open to the rain. But from this devastation, something had emerged that did not exist before, a sense, however fragile, that France was more than a kingdom. Its people had begun to feel they belonged to something larger than their lord, their village, or their province. A nation still unnamed and still uncertain of its shape was stirring beneath the ruins. The war was over, but the France that emerged from it was exhausted, ravaged, and in desperate need of rebuilding. The work of recovery and of transforming a battered medieval kingdom into a centralized modern state was only just beginning. Chapter 12: Renaissance, Reformation, and the Wars of Religion. The century that followed the 100 Years' War carried France through one of the most turbulent transformations in its history. From the ashes of medieval devastation, through the brilliance of the Renaissance, into the blood-soaked fury of religious civil war. The man who began Reconstruction was not the war's hero, Charles VII, but his son, Louis XI. He came to the throne in 1461 and proved to be one of the shrewdest rulers France had ever known. Where his predecessors had relied on chivalry and military force, Louis governed through diplomacy, bribery, espionage, and an instinct for exploiting the weaknesses of others. His greatest challenge was the Duchy of Burgundy. Under Duke Charles the Bold, Burgundy had become a powerful state straddling the border between France and the Holy Roman Empire, with revenues rivaling those of the crown itself. Charles the Bold dreamed of creating a kingdom of his own, a middle realm between France and Germany, and Louis understood that as long as Burgundy existed, French unity was impossible. Rather than confront Burgundy directly, Louis worked to isolate it. He bribed the English into neutrality. He stirred revolt in the Burgundian heartland of Flanders. He encouraged the Swiss Confederation and the Duke of Lorraine to make war on Charles the Bold. In 1477, Charles was killed at the Battle of Nancy, his body found days later in an icy ditch, half-eaten by wolves. The threat was broken. Louis absorbed much of the Burgundian inheritance, though the marriage of Charles's daughter to the Habsburg emperor ensured that the rest, including the wealthy Low Countries, passed into rival hands. The consequences would reverberate for centuries, entangling France in a dynastic rivalry with the House of Habsburg that would dominate European politics for the next 200 years. With Burgundy neutralized and Provence, Anjou, and other territories folded into the crown, France emerged from Louis's reign larger and more centralized than at any time in its history. The stage was set for the next generation's ambitions that would carry French armies across the Alps and into the glittering, fractured world of Renaissance Italy. In 1494, Louis's son, Charles VIII, launched an invasion of the Italian peninsula, claiming the throne of Naples through a tangled web of dynastic inheritance. His army marched south with astonishing ease, entering Naples to cheering crowds. But the triumph was fleeting. A coalition of Italian states, backed by Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, soon forced the French to retreat. What followed was more than half a century of Italian wars, a shifting series of campaigns drawing in every major power in Europe. French kings won spectacular battles and seized great cities, but could never hold their conquests for long. By the time the wars ended with the Treaty of Cateau-Cambrésis in 1559, France had gained nothing in Italy but had transformed itself and Europe. The Italian wars introduced France to the Renaissance. French soldiers and nobles who had seen the palaces, paintings, and gardens of Florence, Milan, and Rome returned home dazzled. Italian artists, architects, and scholars were invited to the French court. The chateaux of the Loire Valley, Chambord, Chenonceau, Amboise, rose in a new style that married Italian elegance with French grandeur. A cultural revolution was underway. But alongside beauty came a darker transformation. The same century that brought the Renaissance to France also brought the Reformation, a religious upheaval that would tear the kingdom apart. Inspired by the teachings of Martin Luther, and especially John Calvin, a growing number of French men and women rejected the authority of the Catholic Church and embraced Protestantism. The French Protestants were called Huguenots. They drew their strength from the merchant classes, from educated professionals, and from a significant portion of the nobility, particularly in the South and West. Calvinism, with its emphasis on individual faith, scriptural authority, and the abolition of church hierarchy, appealed powerfully to those who resented clerical corruption and sought greater autonomy in both spiritual and worldly affairs. The French crown's attitude toward the Huguenots shifted with the political winds. Francis I had tolerated them when it suited his foreign policy. Henry II persecuted them harshly. But when Henry died suddenly in 1559, killed by a lance splinter during a tournament, and his young, weak successors proved unable to control the court, the tensions that had been building for decades finally ignited. In 1562, the Duke of Guise, leader of the ultra-Catholic faction, ordered an attack on a Huguenot congregation at Versailles, killing dozens of worshippers. The massacre triggered open war. For the next 3 decades, France was torn by a series of religious civil wars so savage that they destroyed more than 2 centuries of slow, patient nation-building in a single generation. The worst atrocity came on the night of August the 23rd, 1572, the eve of St. Bartholomew's Day. What began as a targeted killing of Huguenot leaders in Paris escalated into a citywide massacre. Catholic mobs hunted Protestants through the streets. The violence spread to other cities across France. By the time the bloodshed subsided, an estimated 10,000 to 20,000 Huguenots had been murdered. The wars of religion dragged on for another quarter century after St. Bartholomew's Day, each side committing atrocities, each side inviting foreign intervention, the Huguenots from Protestant England and the German princes, the Catholic League from Spain. The wars are estimated to have cost over 2 million lives, more than 1/10 of the French population. The economy contracted sharply. Fields lay fallow. Trade routes fell silent. The resolution came not through the victory of one side over the other, but through the exhaustion of both and through the unlikely figure of Henry of Navarre, a Bourbon prince and a Protestant. Henry was the nearest legitimate heir to the throne after the last Valois king, Henry III, was assassinated in 1589. But Catholic Paris would not accept a Protestant king. Henry's response was as pragmatic as it was famous. In 1593, he converted to Catholicism, reportedly remarking that Paris was worth a mass. The conversion was calculated, but it worked. Paris opened its gates. The Civil War wound down, and in 1598, Henry issued the Edict of Nantes, a landmark decree granting Huguenots the right to worship freely in designated areas and hold certain fortified towns. The Edict of Nantes did not create equality between the faiths. Catholics retained their dominance, and the Huguenots were tolerated rather than embraced. But it was, for its time, a remarkable act of political moderation, an acknowledgement that religious uniformity could not be imposed by force, and that a state could survive, even prosper, with more than one faith within its borders. Henry IV proved to be one of France's most capable kings, rebuilding roads, encouraging agriculture, restoring the treasury, and earning a reputation for genuine concern for ordinary people. He dreamed of a France at peace, where every peasant could afford a chicken in the pot on Sundays. But in 1610, a Catholic fanatic named Ravaillac stabbed him to death in his carriage on a Paris street. The kingdom Henry left behind was fragile, patched together from decades of civil war, held in balance by edicts and compromises, shadowed by religious hatreds not yet resolved. The great question remained: could France become a unified state, strong enough to impose order on its nobility and defend itself against its rivals? The answer would arrive in a king who believed himself to be that very answer, and his name would become a synonym for royal power itself. Chapter 13: The Sun King, Absolutism, Versailles, and the Limits of Glory. The king who answered that question ruled France for 72 years, the longest reign in European history, and by the time he was finished, no one in the kingdom or beyond it could doubt what royal power, taken to its absolute limit, looked like. Henry IV's assassination in 1610 left the throne to his 9-year-old son, Louis XIII. The boy was quiet, sickly, and overshadowed from the start. Real power during much of his reign belonged to his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, a man of extraordinary intelligence, iron will, and an unwavering belief that the greatness of the French state came before all other considerations. Richelieu reshaped France. He broke the military power of the Huguenots while leaving their religious freedoms intact. He crushed conspiracies among the high nobility with ruthless efficiency. He drew France into the 30 Years' War, a catastrophic conflict consuming the Holy Roman Empire, not to defend the faith but to weaken the Habsburgs, France's greatest rival on the European stage. When Richelieu died in 1642, and Louis XIII followed him to the grave a year later, the crown passed once again to a child, a boy of 4 named Louis. His mother, Anne of Austria, served as regent, and the real power fell to another cardinal minister, Jules Mazarin, who continued Richelieu's policies with equal skill and considerably more charm. The young king's early years were marked by a violent upheaval known as the Fronde, a series of civil rebellions by nobles and parliamentarians who resented the concentration of royal authority. Paris itself was convulsed by barricades and street fighting. The boy king was forced to flee his capital in the middle of a winter night, a humiliation he would carry with him for the rest of his life. When Mazarin died in 1661, Louis XIV, now 22 years old, announced that he would govern alone, no more chief ministers, no more cardinal favorites. The king himself would be the center of all decision, all authority, all power. It was a declaration that stunned the court, and over the next 5 decades, Louis made good on every word of it. He built his government around a small circle of ministers chosen not from the old nobility, but from the professional classes. Men who owed their position entirely to the king and whose loyalty was therefore absolute. The most capable of these was Jean-Baptiste Colbert, who overhauled the tax system, promoted French industry, expanded overseas trade, and attempted to impose order on the kingdom's chaotic finances. But the supreme expression of Louis's vision was not a policy or a war. It was a building. Beginning in the 1660s, Louis transformed a modest hunting lodge at Versailles, southwest of Paris, into the largest and most magnificent palace in Europe, a sprawling complex of marble, gilt, glass, and manicured gardens that became both the seat of government and the stage on which royal power was performed. Versailles was designed to awe. Its hall of mirrors stretched nearly 80 meters, lined with 357 mirrors reflecting the light of thousands of candles. The gardens, designed by André Lenout, extended for kilometers in geometric perfection. Fountains, groves, and pathways arranged with the precision of a mathematical proof. Nature itself had been made to obey the king's will. The great nobles of France were drawn to Versailles not by choice but by necessity. Louis made attendance at court essential for anyone who wished to retain royal favor, land, or office. Stripped of their provincial power bases and trapped in an elaborate daily routine of ceremony, the aristocracy was transformed from a class of independent warlords into a class of courtiers dependent on the king's attention for their status. Louis pursued glory abroad with the same appetite he brought to everything else. He fought a succession of wars: the War of Devolution, the Dutch War, the War of the League of Augsburg, and finally the War of the Spanish Succession, each aimed at expanding French territory, favorable borders and establishing France as the undisputed master of European affairs. These wars brought France Alsace, Franche-Comté, and a string of fortified towns along the northern and eastern frontiers, strategic gains that would define the country's borders for centuries. But they also drained the treasury, devastated the countryside, and turned most of Europe against France. By the end of Louis's reign, the costs of perpetual war had become nearly unbearable. In 1685, Louis made what many historians consider his gravest mistake. He revoked the Edict of Nantes, stripping French Protestants of the legal protections they had held for nearly a century. Huguenot churches were demolished, conversions were forced. Hundreds of thousands of Huguenots, many of them skilled artisans, merchants, and professionals, fled France for the Protestant states of Europe, taking their talents and their capital with them. The loss was enormous. The economies of Prussia, the Dutch Republic, and England were enriched by the very people France had expelled, and the revocation hardened Protestant Europe's resolve against Louis, fueling the coalitions that would fight him in his final wars, and ensuring that France's bid for continental dominance would be resisted at every turn. The last of those wars, the War of the Spanish Succession, was triggered when Louis placed his grandson on the Spanish throne, raising the specter of a Franco-Spanish superpower. A grand alliance of England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and smaller states fought to prevent it. The war ground on for 13 years, and though Louis's grandson kept Spain, France paid a terrible price in blood and treasure. Louis XIV died on the 1st of September 1715, aged 76. He had outlived his son and his grandson. The heir was his great-grandson, a boy of 5. France was exhausted, deeply in debt, and surrounded by wary neighbors. The Sun King had made France the cultural center of Europe, but the brilliance had come at a cost the kingdom would spend generations trying to repay. The palace at Versailles still gleamed in the autumn light, but behind its golden facades, the cracks in the structure, financial, social, and political, were already spreading, quietly and irreversibly, toward a reckoning that no amount of splendor could prevent. Chapter 14. Enlightenment and the Crumbling Throne. The century that separated the death of Louis XIV from the explosion of 1789 was a time of extraordinary paradox, an age of intellectual brilliance and political paralysis, of growing wealth and deepening inequality, of reform attempted and reform denied. Louis XIV left behind a kingdom in financial ruin. The regency fell to the Duke of Orléans, Philippe II, a man of sharp intelligence and scandalous personal habits. He inherited a debt so vast that the annual budget deficit exceeded the total revenue of the state. The old methods of borrowing and taxing were exhausted. Something radical was needed. The regent turned to a Scottish financier named John Law, who proposed a bold experiment, a central bank issuing paper money, backed not by gold but by confidence in future economic growth. Law's system initially performed brilliantly. His Mississippi Company, which held exclusive trading rights to French Louisiana, attracted frenzied investment. Share prices soared. Fortunes were made overnight in the coffee houses and salons of Paris. But the bubble could not hold. The company's real revenues were a fraction of its speculative valuation. When Law attempted to cool the frenzy through policy adjustments, panic spread instead. In 1720, the bubble burst catastrophically. Thousands of investors were ruined. The trauma left France deeply suspicious of paper money and financial innovation, a wariness that would handicap French banking for generations and give Britain a lasting advantage. The regent died in 1723, and the young Louis XV assumed nominal control. He had been king since the age of 5, but the years of regency had shaped his temperament in ways that would mark his entire reign. He had watched power wielded, contested, and compromised from the shadows, and what he learned was caution, a deep reluctance to force any issue to its breaking point. Louis XV was intelligent and well-informed. He understood the structural weaknesses of the French state, the exemption of the nobility and clergy from most taxation, the patchwork of provincial privileges that prevented uniform governance, the growing restlessness of a population excluded from political power. He even foresaw the consequences, reportedly remarking with chilling clarity, "After me, the flood." But understanding was not the same as acting. Louis lacked the political will to force reform against the entrenched resistance of the parliaments, the powerful law courts that served as the voice of the privileged classes. Every attempt at fiscal modernization was blocked, watered down, or reversed. The system groaned under its own contradictions, and the king, temperamentally averse to confrontation, let it groan. Meanwhile, an intellectual revolution was unfolding in the salons, coffee houses, and publishing houses of Paris. A generation of thinkers, the philosophers, were subjecting every institution, every tradition, and every assumption of the old order to the scrutiny of reason. Their project was nothing less than the reimagining of society from its foundations. Voltaire, the most famous of them all, attacked religious intolerance and arbitrary power with a wit so sharp it could not be suppressed. Montesquieu, in his Spirit of the Laws, argued that political liberty required the separation of powers, an idea that would echo through the American and French constitutions. Diderot and d'Alembert compiled the Encyclopédie, a vast compendium of knowledge designed to make reason accessible to all. And then there was Rousseau. In his Social Contract published in 1762, he declared that legitimate government could rest only on the consent of the governed, that sovereignty belonged not to the king but to the people. The words were incendiary. They did not cause the revolution that followed, but they gave it a language, a philosophy, and a moral certainty that no royal pageantry could match. The ideas of the Enlightenment spread not through universities, but through an informal network of salons, gatherings hosted in the private drawing rooms of wealthy women, where philosophers, writers, and reform-minded aristocrats debated politics, science, and society over candlelight and coffee. The salons were not revolutionary cells, but they created an atmosphere in which questioning authority became fashionable and deference to tradition became suspect. France's standing in the world, meanwhile, was slipping. The 7 Years' War, which ended in 1763, cost France nearly all of its colonial empire, Canada, most of its Indian territories, and its dominant position in the Caribbean were lost to Britain. The defeat was a blow not only to French prestige but to its treasury, which was already staggering under the weight of accumulated debt. Louis XV died in 1774, unloved and unmourned. His grandson, Louis XVI, inherited a kingdom in desperate need of reform and a political system incapable of delivering it. Louis XVI was decent, well-meaning, and genuinely concerned for the welfare of his people. He was also indecisive, easily influenced, and temperamentally unsuited to the crisis that was bearing down upon him. In a fateful act of idealism and strategy, Louis XVI committed France to supporting the American Revolution, sending troops, ships, and money to help the colonists win independence from Britain. The cause was popular, and the victory at Yorktown in 1781 was celebrated in Paris as a triumph of liberty. But the cost was staggering. The war added billions of livres to an already catastrophic national debt. By the late 1780s, the French state was effectively bankrupt. Tax reform was blocked by the privileged classes. The harvest of 1788 was disastrous, sending bread prices soaring. Hunger, resentment, and a growing conviction that the system itself was broken, not merely mismanaged, converged into a pressure that could no longer be contained within the old structures. In the summer of 1789, Louis XVI was forced to summon the Estates General, an assembly of clergy, nobility, and commoners that had not met since 1614. It was intended as a last resort, a way to negotiate new taxes and restore order. Instead, it became the fuse that ignited the most consequential political upheaval in modern European history. The delegates gathered at Versailles in May. The Third Estate, representing the common people, found itself outvoted and ignored. On the 20th of June, locked out of their meeting hall, they reconvened in a nearby indoor tennis court and swore an oath not to disband until France had a constitution. The gesture was quiet, almost polite, but it was a revolution. The old world was ending. And in the streets of Paris, where bread was scarce and patience had run out, the people were already beginning to move. Chapter 15. Revolution. The world turned upside down. What began with an oath on a tennis court would, within 5 years, sweep away the monarchy, the church, the calendar, and the very names by which French men and women addressed one another, and leave behind a legacy that the world is still debating today. On the 14th of July, 1789, a Parisian crowd, angry, hungry, and searching for weapons, converged on the Bastille, a medieval fortress in the east of the city that served as a royal prison and a symbol of arbitrary power. After hours of confused negotiation and sporadic gunfire, the garrison surrendered. The crowd surged in. The governor was killed. His head was mounted on a pike. The Bastille held only 7 prisoners that day. Its military significance was negligible, but its symbolic destruction sent a tremor through France and across Europe. The old order, which had seemed immovable, could be broken. Within weeks, peasants across the countryside were burning manor houses, destroying feudal records, and refusing to pay the dues they had owed for centuries. The Great Fear had begun. The National Assembly moved swiftly to channel the upheaval. On the night of the 4th of August, in a session of almost delirious self-sacrifice, the nobility voluntarily renounced their feudal privileges, tithes, serfdom, hunting rights, and seigneurial courts. Centuries of accumulated privilege were swept away in a single sitting. It was one of the most remarkable legislative nights in the history of any parliament. Later that month, the Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, a document that declared all men free and equal in rights, that sovereignty resided in the nation, and that law was the expression of the general will. Its principles owed much to the Enlightenment and to the American Declaration of Independence. Its consequences would reach far beyond either. For a time, compromise seemed possible. Most of the assembly and most of the country did not want to abolish the monarchy. They wanted to reform it, to transform Louis XVI from an absolute king into a constitutional one, reigning under laws made by elected representatives. A new constitution was being drafted. The future, though uncertain, appeared to hold the promise of orderly change. That hope was shattered on a June night in 1791. Louis, whose freedom had been increasingly curtailed in Paris, attempted to flee the capital with his family. The plan was to reach the eastern frontier, rally loyal troops, and negotiate from a position of military strength, but the escape was bungled. The royal family was recognized at the town of Varennes and brought back to Paris under guard. The flight to Varennes destroyed the foundation of constitutional monarchy, trust in the king. If Louis had been willing to flee rather than accept the new order, how could the nation believe he would govern faithfully under a constitution he had not chosen? The question split the assembly and radicalized the streets. Calls for a republic grew louder. The political center began to collapse. In April of 1792, France declared war on Austria. The revolutionaries believed the war would expose traitors at home and spread the principles of liberty abroad. The early campaigns were disastrous. French armies, stripped of many experienced officers who had fled the country, stumbled and retreated. Panic spread through Paris. Suspicion turned inward. Every setback at the front fed the conviction that enemies lurked within. On the 10th of August, a Parisian crowd stormed the Tuileries Palace, overwhelming the Swiss Guard in a battle that left hundreds dead on the marble stairways and in the courtyards. Louis and his family fled to the assembly for protection. The monarchy was effectively finished. What followed was a descent into violence that even the revolution's most fervent supporters had not foreseen. In September, as enemy armies approached Paris, mobs broke into the city's prisons and slaughtered more than 1,000 inmates, aristocrats, priests, common criminals, and anyone suspected of royalist sympathies. The September massacres were not ordered by any government. They erupted from a collective terror so intense that it overwhelmed all restraint. A new and dangerous logic was taking hold. Fear was becoming its own justification for violence. Later that month, the newly elected National Convention abolished the monarchy and proclaimed the French Republic. In January of 1793, Louis XVI was tried for treason, found guilty, and sent to the guillotine. His execution was carried out in a public square before a vast and largely silent crowd. The blade fell. A chapter of French history stretching back to Clovis was closed forever. The killing of the king did not bring stability. It intensified the crisis. War expanded. Britain, Spain, and the Dutch Republic joined the coalition against France. Internal revolts erupted in the Vendée and other regions. Food shortages worsened. The moderate Girondin faction, unable to contain the chaos, was overthrown by the more radical Montagnards, led by a lawyer from Arras named Maximilien Robespierre. Under Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, the revolution entered its darkest phase, the Terror. A law permitted the arrest of anyone deemed an enemy of liberty. Revolutionary tribunals dispensed summary justice. In less than a year, more than 30,000 people were executed or died in prison. The guillotine became the emblem of an age that had set out to liberate and ended by devouring its own. The terror consumed not only royalists and alleged traitors, but also former revolutionaries, Danton, Desmoulins, Hébert, each faction devouring the one before it. By the summer of 1794, Robespierre himself had become the object of the fear he had wielded. On the 9th of Thermidor, the 27th of July, his colleagues in the convention turned on him. He was arrested and guillotined the following day. The fall of Robespierre ended the terror but left France exhausted and adrift. The convention gave way to a new government, the Directory, a five-man executive that struggled to maintain economic collapse, political corruption, and the ongoing pressure of foreign war. France had destroyed the old world, but had not yet built a new one capable of standing in its place. Power was slipping toward the army, the one institution that still functioned, still won victories, and still commanded loyalty. And within that army, one general in particular was rising with a speed and ambition that no civilian government could hope to contain. He was young, Corsican, brilliant, and utterly without illusions about the fragility of the republic he had sworn to defend. His hour was approaching. Chapter 16, Napoleon, Glory, Empire, and Exile. He came out of the revolution like a blade drawn from a forge, hardened, precise, and dangerous. Within 15 years he would remake France, redraw the map of Europe, and leave behind a legacy so vast that the world is still living inside parts of it today. On the 9th of November, 1799, the 18th of Brumaire by the revolutionary calendar, General Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew the Directory in a swift, carefully staged coup. The Republic, already hollowed out by years of instability, offered little resistance. Napoleon installed himself as first consul, the head of a new government that preserved the language of the Republic while concentrating real power in his hands alone. He moved with astonishing speed. Within months, he had negotiated peace with several of France's enemies, reorganized the civil administration, stabilized the currency, and established the Bank of France. He reopened the churches that the revolution had shuttered and made peace with the Pope, understanding that most French people wanted order and faith restored, not ideology and permanent upheaval. His most enduring achievement was the Civil Code, promulgated in 1804 and later known as the Napoleonic Code. It replaced the bewildering patchwork of feudal, royal, and revolutionary laws with a single, rational, clearly written legal framework. It enshrined equality before the law, the right to property, and the secular authority of the state. Versions of the code would be adopted across Europe and far beyond. In December of 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in a ceremony at Notre Dame de Paris. The Pope was present, but did not place the crown. Napoleon lifted it from the altar and set it upon his own head. The gesture was deliberate. His authority came not from God or tradition, but from his own will and the acclaim of the nation. The years that followed were a blaze of military brilliance. At Austerlitz in 1805, Napoleon destroyed the combined armies of Austria and Russia in a single morning of fog, deception, and devastating counterattack. It was perhaps the most perfect battle he ever fought. The sun that rose through the mist that day became a symbol of Napoleonic genius, the son of Austerlitz. He defeated Prussia at Jena in 1806, with such thoroughness that the Prussian state nearly ceased to exist. He humbled Austria again at Wagram in 1809. He imposed the continental system, a trade blockade designed to strangle Britain's economy by closing every European port to British goods. For a brief, extraordinary moment, Napoleon dominated the continent from Portugal to the borders of Russia, but the empire carried the seeds of its own destruction. The continental system, meant to weaken Britain, instead strangled European commerce and bred resentment among France's reluctant allies. In Spain, a guerrilla war, the word itself was coined during this conflict, bled French forces for years, tying down hundreds of thousands of troops in a struggle that had no clean military solution. The fatal step came in June of 1812, when Napoleon led the largest army Europe had ever seen, over 600,000 men, across the Niemen River and into Russia. The campaign was meant to force Tsar Alexander to enforce the continental system. Instead, it became the most catastrophic military adventure in modern history. The Russians refused battle on Napoleon's terms. They retreated, burned their own crops and villages, and drew the French deeper into the vast emptiness of the interior. When a great battle finally came at Borodino in September, the carnage was horrific but inconclusive. Napoleon entered Moscow a week later and found the city empty and ablaze, set on fire by its own defenders rather than surrendered intact. With no peace forthcoming and winter closing in, Napoleon ordered the retreat. What followed was a nightmare. Temperatures plunged far below freezing. Horses died by the thousands. Soldiers starved, froze, and fell to Cossack raiders who harried the shrinking columns without mercy. Of the 600,000 who had crossed into Russia, fewer than 100,000 returned. The Grand Army had been destroyed. Europe sensed weakness and united against him. At Leipzig in October of 1813, the Battle of the Nations, a coalition of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden defeated Napoleon in the largest battle in European history before the 20th century. The following spring, Allied armies entered Paris. Napoleon abdicated and was exiled to the island of Elba off the Italian coast. His exile lasted less than a year. In March of 1815, Napoleon escaped Elba, landed in southern France, and marched north toward Paris. Soldiers sent to stop him defected to his side. The king fled. Within 3 weeks, Napoleon was back in the Tuileries Palace, ruling France once more. The episode became known as the 100 Days. It ended at Waterloo. On the 18th of June, 1815, outside a small Belgian village, Napoleon faced a combined British and Prussian force under the Duke of Wellington and Field Marshal Blücher. The battle was close and desperate, he decided, in the final hours, by the arrival of Prussian reinforcements on the French flank. By nightfall, the French army was in full retreat. Napoleon's career as a conqueror was finished. He surrendered to the British and was sent to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, a volcanic speck of land surrounded by thousands of kilometers of open ocean. There, in a damp house overlooking a gray sea, he spent the last 6 years of his life dictating memoirs, quarreling with his British jailers, and reshaping the story of his own legend. Napoleon died on the 5th of May, 1821. He was 51 years old. His body was eventually returned to Paris and laid to rest beneath the golden dome of Les Invalides, where it remains to this day, a tomb of polished red granite set into the floor of a circular crypt surrounded by silence and the faint smell of old stone. What he left behind was not a dynasty. His son never ruled, but something more durable, a legal code still underpinning the law of dozens of nations, an administrative system still shaping how France is governed, and a legend so powerful it would color French politics for the next 2 centuries. He had shown the world what one unchecked will could build and what it could destroy. And in his wake, France would spend the rest of the 19th century trying to answer a question he had left unresolved. What kind of country did it want to be? Chapter 17, A Century of Revolutions, From Restoration to the Republic. The 19th century asked France a question it could not settle in a single generation, or even in 5 attempts at government. Between Waterloo and the turn of the 20th century, France would try monarchy, revolution, republic, empire, and republic again, each time searching for a political form that could hold a divided nation together. After Napoleon's defeat, the victorious powers restored the Bourbon dynasty to the French throne. Louis XVIII, brother of the executed Louis XVI, returned to Paris and attempted to govern as a constitutional monarch, a compromise between the old royal tradition and the irreversible changes the revolution had brought. For a time, the arrangement held, sustained by exhaustion more than by conviction. But his successor, Charles X, had no taste for compromise. A rigid conservative who dreamed of restoring the absolute monarchy, Charles attempted in 1830 to dissolve the elected chamber, restrict the press, and narrow the franchise. Paris responded with 3 days of street fighting, the July Revolution that drove him from the throne and into exile. The barricades had spoken again. The new king was Louis Philippe, Duke of Orléans, a man who carried an umbrella instead of a scepter and styled himself the citizen king. His reign, known as the July Monarchy, favored the rising middle class and promoted commerce and industry. But it ignored the growing misery of the urban poor, and its narrow political base left it vulnerable when the economy faltered. In February of 1848, another revolution swept Paris. Louis Philippe abdicated and fled to England. The Second Republic was proclaimed, and for a brief, heady season, universal male suffrage was introduced, and slavery was abolished in French colonies. It was the most democratic moment France had yet experienced. But the Republic was fragile, and the forces pulling it apart were stronger than those holding it together. Out of the chaos emerged a familiar name, Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, nephew of the great emperor. He won the presidential election of 1848 on the strength of his surname and a vague promise to restore order and glory. In 1851, he seized dictatorial power in a coup d'état. A year later, he proclaimed himself Emperor Napoleon III. The Republic had lasted barely 4 years. The Second Empire was a time of transformation. Napoleon III modernized the French economy, expanded the railway network, and encouraged industrial growth. His prefect, Baron Haussmann, demolished much of medieval Paris and rebuilt the city with the wide boulevards, uniform facades, and grand public spaces that define it to this day. The Paris of postcards and films is largely Haussmann's creation. Abroad, Napoleon III pursued an ambitious foreign policy, intervening in Italy, establishing a short-lived empire in Mexico, and expanding French colonial holdings in Africa and Southeast Asia. But his ambitions outran his judgment. In 1870, a diplomatic dispute with Prussia escalated into war, and the French army, overconfident and poorly led, was crushed in a series of devastating defeats. At Sedan, in September of 1870, Napoleon III was captured along with an entire army. The news triggered the immediate collapse of the empire. In Paris, a republic was proclaimed, the Third Republic, born not from revolution but from military catastrophe. Yet, even as the new government tried to organize resistance, Prussian forces encircled Paris and subjected it to a siege lasting 4 months. The siege ended in January of 1871 with a humiliating armistice. France ceded Alsace and most of Lorraine to the new German Empire and agreed to pay an enormous indemnity. But the worst was not yet over. In March, the people of Paris, enraged by the peace terms and by the suffering of the siege, rose in revolt and established the Paris Commune. The Commune lasted 72 days. It was part revolutionary government, part social experiment, part desperate last stand. The communards introduced progressive reforms, free education, workers' rights, the separation of church and state. But they were crushed in May by government troops in a week of savage street fighting known as Bloody Week. An estimated 20,000 Parisians were killed. The scars would take generations to fade. The Third Republic survived the Commune and, against all expectations, endured. It was never loved. The old quip held that the Republic was the system that divided France the least, but it proved functional. It built a national education system, expanded the colonial empire across Africa and Indochina, and presided over a period of cultural brilliance that became known as the Belle Époque. The Republic's gravest test came in the 1890s with the Dreyfus Affair, a scandal in which a Jewish officer was falsely convicted of treason on forged evidence. The case split France between those who defended the army's honor and those who demanded justice for the individual. It became a battle over the Republic's meaning, whether it stood for truth and rights or for tradition and authority. Dreyfus was eventually exonerated, and the affair strengthened the Republic's commitment to secularism, civil liberties, and the rule of law. But it also exposed how deeply divided French society remained between Catholic and secular, between military and civilian, between those who looked backward and those who looked forward. These fractures would not heal before the next century brought a test far more terrible than any political scandal. By 1914, France was the second largest colonial empire in the world, a republic of nearly 40 million people, and a nation still haunted by the loss of Alsace-Lorraine. Across the Rhine, a unified and industrialized Germany was growing stronger every year. The two nations watched each other with a wariness that bordered on obsession. When the crisis finally came, it came quickly. Chapter 18: The World Wars and the Remaking of France. The 20th century brought France to the edge of destruction, twice, and each time, the country that emerged from the wreckage was fundamentally different from the one that had entered the fire. In August of 1914, the long-dreaded war finally broke out. Germany's armies swept through Belgium and into northern France, advancing so rapidly that the French government fled Paris for Bordeaux. But at the Marne, barely 40 kilometers from the capital, the French and British forces held, and then pushed back. The German advance stalled, the front solidified, and what followed was 4 years of hell. The Western Front became a landscape of trenches, barbed wire, mud, and death. From the English Channel to the Swiss border, millions of soldiers faced each other across a narrow strip of devastated earth. Attacks were measured in meters gained and thousands lost. The names of the battles, Verdun, the Somme, Chemin des Dames, became synonyms for suffering on a scale that no previous generation had imagined possible. Verdun, in 1916, was the battle that came to define France's experience of the war. For 10 months, French and German forces fought over a few kilometers of ground in a battle designed by the German command not to capture territory but to bleed France white. Nearly 300,000 soldiers were killed on both sides. The French held, but at a cost that marked the national memory forever. When the armistice came on the 11th of November 1918, France had lost nearly 1.5 million men, more than 1 in 10 of its entire male population. Entire villages had been erased. The industrial north was in ruins. The country that emerged from the war was victorious in name, but shattered in substance. It had won, and the winning had nearly killed it. The peace settlement, the Treaty of Versailles in 1919, returned Alsace-Lorraine to France and imposed heavy reparations on Germany. France wanted security above all, and the treaty was designed to ensure that Germany could never again pose a mortal threat. But the settlement bred resentment in Germany without providing France the lasting guarantees it needed. The foundations of the next catastrophe were already being laid. Between the wars, France built the Maginot Line, a chain of fortifications along the German border, bristling with artillery and linked by underground tunnels. It was an engineering marvel and a psychological crutch. France believed it had made itself invulnerable, but the line did not extend to the Belgian frontier, and it was through Belgium and the supposedly impassable Ardennes that the blow would fall. In May of 1940, German armored forces punched through the Ardennes and crossed the Meuse at Sedan, outflanking the Maginot Line entirely. The speed of the advance stunned the French command. Within days, German tanks had reached the English Channel, cutting the Allied armies in two. At Dunkirk, the British evacuated their forces across the sea. France fought on alone, but the situation was already beyond recovery. On the 14th of June, German troops entered Paris. 8 days later, France signed an armistice. The northern half of the country fell under direct German occupation. The south was governed by a collaborationist regime based in the spa town of Vichy, led by the aged Marshal Pétain, who had been the hero of Verdun a generation before. The fall was swift, total, and profoundly humiliating. But France did not entirely surrender. On the 18th of June, a little-known general named Charles de Gaulle broadcast from London a call to continue the fight. He had no army, no territory, and almost no support. But his refusal to accept defeat created an alternative France, one that existed first in words, then in scattered colonial outposts, and eventually in armed resistance on French soil. Inside occupied France, resistance grew slowly. It began with small acts, underground newspapers, intelligence networks, sabotage of railway lines, and expanded as the occupation deepened, and Vichy's collaboration with Nazi Germany became harder to deny. By 1943, scattered groups were being coordinated into a more unified movement, linked to de Gaulle's Free French Forces abroad. The liberation came from the West. On the 6th of June, 1944, Allied forces landed on the beaches of Normandy in the largest amphibious invasion in history. Over the following weeks, they fought their way inland through the hedgerows and villages of northern France. In August, Paris rose in revolt. French armored units under General Leclerc entered the city, and on the 25th of August, the German garrison surrendered. De Gaulle walked down the Champs-Élysées the following day, through crowds so vast the boulevard could barely contain them. It was a moment of extraordinary emotion, relief, pride, grief, and the beginning of a long reckoning with everything the occupation had revealed about the country. The war in Europe continued until May of 1945. But for France, the liberation of Paris was the turning point. The France that emerged from the Second World War was victorious but deeply scarred. Its cities were damaged, its economy was wrecked, its colonial empire was fraying, and the memory of Vichy, of collaboration, of complicity, of choices made under duress, would haunt French politics and conscience for decades. The old world was gone. What would replace it remained as yet unclear. Chapter 19: Empire's End and the Fifth Republic. The war was won, but the world it returned France to was no longer the one it had left. The old colonial empire was fraying. The old political structures were buckling. And the question of what kind of country France would become in a world now dominated by two superpowers, neither of them European, demanded answers that no one was quite ready to give. The Fourth Republic, established in 1946, was built on good intentions and weak foundations. Its constitution placed power in the hands of a fractious parliament, where shifting coalitions of socialists, Christian Democrats, communists, and centrists formed and dissolved governments with exhausting frequency. In 12 years, France cycled through more than 20 prime ministers. Stability was the one thing the system could not provide. The Republic's fatal weakness was exposed not at home but overseas. In Indochina, France fought for 8 years to hold its colonial possessions against a Vietnamese independence movement led by Ho Chi Minh. The war ended in 1954 with a devastating French defeat at Dien Bien Phu, a remote valley fortress where an entire garrison was overwhelmed after months of siege. France withdrew from Southeast Asia entirely. But the crisis that broke the Fourth Republic came from Algeria. Unlike other colonies, Algeria had long been considered an integral part of France. Over 1 million European settlers lived there, alongside millions of Muslim Algerians who were largely excluded from political and economic life. When the Algerian National Liberation Front launched an armed insurgency in 1954, France found itself facing a war it could neither win nor abandon. The conflict grew more brutal by the year. The French army used torture and mass detention. The insurgents struck with bombings and ambushes. In mainland France, public opinion fractured. And in Algeria itself, the settler population and elements of the military grew increasingly hostile toward a Paris government they saw as weak and indecisive. By 1958, the situation had reached a breaking point. In May of that year, military officers in Algiers staged what amounted to a revolt against civilian rule. France teetered on the brink of civil war. In desperation, the political establishment turned to the one man who seemed capable of holding the country together: Charles de Gaulle, who had withdrawn from politics a decade before. He was summoned back and given authority to draft a new constitution. The Fifth Republic, established in 1958, was built around a strong presidency, a deliberate correction of the parliamentary chaos that had plagued the Fourth. De Gaulle became its first president, and from that position he did what the old system could not. He ended the Algerian War. It took 4 more years of bloodshed and a near coup by enraged officers, but in 1962, Algeria became independent. The loss of Algeria completed France's retreat from empire. But de Gaulle had no intention of allowing France to retreat from the world stage. He pursued an independent foreign policy, developing nuclear weapons, withdrawing France from NATO's integrated military command, and cultivating relationships with countries outside the Western Bloc. France, he insisted, would remain a great power answerable to no one but itself. At the same time, de Gaulle recognized that France's future lay in Europe. The old strategy of containing Germany through force had failed twice. A new approach was needed, one that bound Germany and France together within a shared institutional framework. The Franco-German partnership, formalized in the Alesia Treaty of 1963, became the engine of European integration and remains so to this day. Domestically, de Gaulle presided over the final phase of the Trente Glorieuses, the 30 glorious years of post-war economic growth that transformed France from a war-ravaged, largely rural society into a modern industrial power. Living standards soared, cities expanded, a new consumer culture took hold. France had never been so prosperous, and yet, beneath the surface, a generation was growing restless. In May of 1968, that restlessness erupted. Student protests over university conditions escalated into battles with police, which triggered the largest general strike in French history. Factories were occupied. Universities were barricaded. The movement had no single leader and no coherent program, but its message was clear. The old hierarchies were no longer accepted, and a new society was demanding to be heard. De Gaulle survived the crisis, barely, through a combination of political concessions and a call to order that rallied conservative voters. But the spirit of '68 did not vanish. It seeped into French culture, education, and social attitudes, loosening old structures of authority and opening space for movements that would reshape the country in the decades ahead. Feminism, environmentalism, and a broader demand for personal freedom. De Gaulle resigned in 1969 after losing a referendum. He died the following year. The Fifth Republic he had built, however, endured, and would prove to be the most durable constitutional framework France had known since the Ancien Regime. Its strong presidency, its capacity for decisive action, and its ability to absorb crises without collapsing would be tested many times in the decades to come. Chapter 20. The Unfinished Republic. France in the Modern World. The story of France does not end with a final chapter. It continues, unresolved, contested, and still being written in the streets, the parliament, and the daily lives of 67 million people who share a republic but do not always agree on what it means. The oil crisis of 1973 brought the post-war boom to an abrupt halt. Energy prices surged, growth slowed. Unemployment, which had been virtually unknown during the glorious years, became a permanent feature of French life. The old bargain, in which steady growth funded expanding welfare, rising wages, and social peace, was no longer sustainable. The cracks that prosperity had papered over began to show. The political landscape shifted. In 1981, François Mitterrand became the first socialist president of the Fifth Republic, promising nationalization, higher wages, and a break with the economic orthodoxy of the right. Within 2 years, fiscal reality forced a reversal. The experiment demonstrated a hard truth, that in an interconnected global economy, even a major European state had limited room for independent economic action. Europe itself became both a lifeline and a source of tension. The Maastricht Treaty of 1992, which created the European Union and set the path toward a common currency, passed in a French referendum by the narrowest of margins. The vote revealed a country divided between those who saw Europe as France's future and those who feared it meant the erosion of sovereignty and national identity. As the century turned, France confronted questions that no treaty or election could easily resolve. Decades of immigration from North Africa and the former colonies had transformed the population. The children and grandchildren of those immigrants were French citizens by law, yet many found themselves shut out from opportunity. Concentrated in suburban housing estates where unemployment was high, schools were underfunded, and the Republic's promise of equality rang hollow. In 2005, the tension exploded. The deaths of 2 teenagers fleeing police in the Paris suburb of Clichy-sous-Bois triggered weeks of rioting across French cities. Cars burned. Schools were set ablaze. The violence had no political program, but its meaning was difficult to ignore. A generation was declaring that the Republic had failed to include them, and patience had run out. A decade later, a different crisis struck. In January and November of 2015, terrorist attacks in Paris killed nearly 150 people, targeting the satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo, a kosher supermarket, cafes, a concert hall, and the area near the National Stadium. The violence pushed questions of security, identity, and the boundaries of tolerance to the center of French life. In 2017, Emmanuel Macron, young, centrist, and positioning himself beyond the traditional divisions of left and right, won the presidency and shattered the old party system. His movement promised modernization, European engagement, and technocratic competence. But the promise collided almost immediately with a society that remained deeply unequal and increasingly suspicious of distant elites. In 2018, the Yellow Vest movement erupted across provincial France, triggered by a fuel tax but fueled by years of frustration over rising costs, declining services, and the feeling that the country was governed for the benefit of cities and a narrow professional class. The roundabouts of small-town France became improvised forums for a grievance that had no single name but many faces. By the mid-2020s, the French political landscape had fractured further. The old parties of left and right had splintered. The National Assembly, after snap elections in 2024, was divided into blocs that could barely cooperate, let alone govern. The strong presidency that de Gaulle had designed to cut through parliamentary paralysis now found itself facing a parliament too fragmented to be led and too restless to be ignored. And yet France endures, not because its problems have been solved, but because it has always been a country in argument with itself about power, equality, and who belongs. From the cave painters of Lascaux to the builders of Carnac, from Celtic chieftains to Roman roads, from the baptism of Clovis to the crown of Charlemagne, this land has never stopped asking what it is. From the cathedrals of the Ile-de-France to the barricades of Paris, from the Revolution's declaration that all men are born free to the Republic's ongoing struggle to make that promise real, France has been reimagining itself for thousands of years. And perhaps that is the deepest truth about this country. It is never completed, only continued. Tonight, you have walked a very long road, from the silence of prehistoric caves to the noise of a modern republic still searching for its shape. The story of France is not a story with a neat ending. It is a story that opens outward into a future that no one can yet see. The fire in the cave has long since gone out. The standing stones still stand. The cathedral windows still catch the light, and somewhere along the Seine, in the city that Clovis chose and Haussmann remade, the lights are coming on, one by one, as another evening settles over a country that has been here in one form or another for a very long time. If this journey brought you peace or wonder or the quiet pleasure of a story well heard, we are glad. Rest now. The world will still be here when you wake. And if you enjoyed tonight's walk through history, perhaps leave a gentle word or stay close. There are many more stories waiting, and each one begins, like this one, with a door opening softly into another world. Good night.